Chapter 899. The study fell into an absolute silence for a moment. Li Tianlan's voice was very soft, but it had an absolutely powerful impact, which almost broke everyone's normal emotions in an instant. The speaker of the province, the director of Zhongzhou State, the member of Zhongzhou State, no matter how knowledgeable they were, it was hard to accept this fact in a short time. The Flourishing Age Fund, Han Donglu. The code name was Military Counselor. The Flourishing Age Fund was the property of Samsara Palace. Until now, the Flourishing Age Fund was Li Tianlan's property? What did this mean? Dongqing Wudi, who had been silent for a full minute, finally came to his senses. He took a deep breath subconsciously and didn't know what it meant for a moment. The Flourishing Age Fund. Emperor Dong's Palace. Han Dong Lin. Dongqing Wudi's eyes became a little confused. By Zhanfang, by Qingqian, Zhou Yuanshan, everyone was a little confused. The Flourishing Age Fund didn't exist for a long time. About a decade ago, they grew rapidly and expanded at an incredible speed. They could be seen in every huge financial storm in the world. They became the planners from the very beginning. Star State, Europe, East Island, Southeast Asia, Snow Country, the financial crises were real bloody storms and whales everywhere. The Flourishing Age Fund seemed to be a prophet, and its dangerous operations reaped miraculous returns. To this day, no one knew how crazy the Flourishing Age Fund was making money. Everyone only saw that their strength was becoming stronger and stronger at an unimaginable speed. Now it had become one of the largest hedge funds in the world. Dongqing Wudi blinked his eyes and tried to digest the explosive news. Li Tianlan had no foreshadowing before, so the news was really unexpected to them, and they were not mentally prepared at all. The Flourishing Age Fund was Li Tianlan's property. First of all, it meant that Li Tianlan and even the entire Emperor Dong's palace would never be short of money in the future. Even if Li Tianlan lost control of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, the Flourishing Age Fund could easily support the development of the entire Emperor Dong's palace, not to mention the 5 countries in Eastern Europe that were making a lot of money every day. Well, it was easy. Dongqing Wudi was silent for a while and shook his head. It was really easy. Secondly, Li Tianlan had invisibly become a partner of a large number of international giants. In this way, Emperor Dong's palace would have no lack of investment in the future. Once this news was exposed, Emperor Dong's palace, which had been developing at a crazy speed, would further develop faster. The power of money would radiate throughout Tian'an and shorten the time for Li Tianlan to unify Tian'an. And then, the close relationship between Han Donglu and the 6 would become Li Tianlan's relationship. No, at the moment, the Special Warfare Group was in a precarious situation, and the Prince Group's foundation was also unstable. A considerable number of people in these 2 groups would be shaken. Once the fact that the Flourishing Age Fund belonged to Li Tianlan was exposed, sufficient financial resources, absolute military strength, a bright future, and huge support, all of this could make many people of the 2 groups board Li Tianlan's boat with the help of their relationship with Han Donglu. The Prince Group and the Special Warfare Group were the same. There must be Han Donglu's people in the Giant Group, and so would the Southeast Group. Most importantly, the North Group. All the signs showed that Han Donglu had a strong influence on the North Group, especially the potential leader of the North Group. His relationship with Han Donglu was practically indestructible. Dongqing Wudi suddenly thought of the past 2 years when the Giant Group was reshuffled. The North Group stood firmly on the side of the academics and the Prince Group and took one valuable position after another from the Southeast Group and the Giant Group. The strength of the North Group expanded rapidly. If there was no accident, Zhou Yunhai of the North Group would be re-elected in next year's election, and at least 2 people from the North Group would become the new members of parliament. Was the increased strength of the North Group Li Tianlan's strength? Military Counselor had been preparing for more than 2 years ago. On this day? In the past 2 years, the strength of the Giant Group had shrunk greatly because of the reshuffling. But if the North Group was added, its strength was even stronger than in its heyday. Dongqing Wudi's mind was buzzing. He thought of the most obvious points and felt a little emotional. He believed that it must be more than that. The combination of the Flourishing Age Fund and Emperor Dong's palace would completely cause a series of chain reactions. The Flourishing Age Fund made up for all the shortcomings of Emperor Dong's palace, whether in wealth or politics. There were more things that Emperor Dong's palace could not see at the moment. Zhongzhou State had made several secret asset evaluations on the Flourishing Age Fund, but all the evaluation reports were not comprehensive and could not even get a general outline. Han Donglu had been too low-key before, at least in Zhongzhou State. Not many people knew what he had done in Zhongzhou State. He subconsciously took out a cigarette and lit it. He took a deep breath and asked with some uncertainty, "Really?" He knew that Li Tianlan could not bullshit on this matter. If he had not gotten military counselor's promise or even allegiance, and was 100% sure that the Flourishing Age Fund was under his control, then even if Han Donglu was really military counselor, Li Tianlan would not have told him the news. The fact that he could say it meant that military counselor had fully proved his loyalty. The destruction of the Samsara Palace, the death of the master of Samsara Palace, and everything that once belonged to her were completely given to Li Tianlan by her. And it seemed that all of this was not out of control at present. Except for the one in Northern Europe. Dongqing Wudi suddenly felt a little complicated. It was a kind of feeling that could not be put into words. Really? Li Tianlan simply nodded. Dongqing Wudi took a deep breath, and his heart became more and more complicated. He thought of the master of Samsara Palace again. Everyone thought that the Samsara Palace had no power in Zhongzhou State. The Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City had always been very vigilant against other forces entering Zhongzhou State in the past. But who could have thought that without anyone noticing, the Samsara Palace had already extended its hands to Mount Shu and even set up the Flourishing Age Fund? He shook his head and whispered, "Now, if everything goes well, you can totally set up a new group." The others finally came to their senses. Bai Qingqian breathed a sigh of relief and nodded. Indeed, a new group may not be as good as the academics and the Southeast group, but in terms of potential, it is definitely the most promising of all groups. If there was no accident, Dongqing Wudi spoke very cautiously. But in fact, everyone knew that it was almost impossible for there to be an accident. The Flourishing Age Fund made up for all the shortcomings and defects of Emperor Dong's palace. Li Tianlan had all the connections, resources, wealth, and absolutely powerful forces. What Emperor Dong's palace lacked most now was the foundation accumulated over a long period of time. But the new forces generally had strong cohesion, which could make up for this to a certain extent. Although Emperor Dong's palace had no foundation, the Purgatory of Heaven capital inherited many things from the Li family. Li Tianlan was bound to take over the Purgatory of Heaven capital. Then Emperor Dong's palace would almost be another Wang family of Beihai. And it would be a replica of the Wang family of Beihai. The Chosen One and the Dynasty. This was a magnificent event that everyone was looking forward to. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Li Tianlan nodded and said slowly, "That's what I'm going to do next." Dongqing Wudi froze for a moment and instantly understood what Li Tianlan meant. "You want to set up a new group?" Li Tianlan replied with a hum. Dongqing Wudi vaguely understood what Li Tianlan wanted to talk to Bai Qingqian today. He smiled and whispered, "When I communicated with the president today, the president mentioned Prime Minister Hua and said that you seem to have a different view." "I see." Li Tianlan did not agree to let Hua Xingyang go further because he wanted to leave enough room for his group to develop. As the situation became clear, Wu Jingmin was likely to become a director from a counselor this time. No matter what position, a director was enough to support the top structure of a group. However, with the resources Li Tianlan had now, it was difficult to find a suitable candidate for counselor. So, Dongqing Wudi glanced at his wife. Without any hesitation, he nodded and said with a smile, "Yes, now the time is very suitable. I will fully support you." "Thank you, Minister." Li Tianlan nodded seriously and glanced at Bai Qingqian. Intentionally or unintentionally. Bai Qingqian raised her eyebrows slightly and said with a soft smile, "Do you want me to go there?" The word, "past," was easy to say, but it wasn't easy to do. Li Tianlan had a good relationship with the giant group. The new group would certainly have a good relationship with the giant group. But there were bound to be different voices inside any group. This was the same as the existence of different groups in any country. It was unavoidable. Moreover, the structure of the giant group was relatively loose. The new group and the giant group could maintain the same general direction, which was already a reflection of their excellent relationship. There were bound to be conflicts in all aspects in daily life. Bai Qingqian had to change her position from the giant group to the new group. And it was a very clear change. The most direct change was that Bai Qingqian would definitely support the policy that was beneficial to Emperor Dong's palace when it was in line with the interests of Zhongzhou state. This might hurt the interests of some people in the giant group, intentionally or unintentionally. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and was silent for a while. Then he whispered, "Yes, and I hope brother-in-law will come." His voice was calm, and he didn't hide his ambition and purpose at all. Asking Bai Qingqian to come here might be regarded as an emergency. He hoped that Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian could lay out the layout for the new group in the next 5 years. But asking Zhou Yuanshan to come to the new group was tantamount to telling Dongqing Wudi that he wanted to take away the future of the giant group. He would constantly absorb fresh blood from the giant group, absorb the forces around him, and absorb the forces that could unite into the new group. The new group would be completely dominated by him. In short, it was annexation. Annexation of the giant group. It was naked, without any disguise. Dongqing Wudi's eyes remained unchanged. He chuckled and said, "Yes, as I said, I fully support it." Bai Qingqian also nodded. The reshuffle of the giant group was to get rid of those who didn't recognize Li Tianlan's position. If Li Tianlan could set up a new group and slowly absorb the forces that recognized Li Tianlan, it would be better. After all, no matter how the giant group was reshuffled, its relatively loose structure was difficult to change. Li Tianlan's body shook slightly. He took a deep look at Dongqing Wudi. The corner of his mouth moved, but he didn't make a sound. The door of the study was pushed open. Qin Weibai, who played the role of a waitress, came in with brewed tea and took away the cigarette from Li Tianlan's mouth when she went out. "I have no opinion." Zhou Yuanshan laughed. He knew what he represented here today. He represented not only himself but also another pillar of the giant group, the Zhou family. "Which position do you want Qingqian to take?" Bai Zhanfang said with a smile. He directly cut into the development of the new group, which was a tacit acquiescence to Li Tianlan's idea. Dongqing Wudi, Bai Zhanfeng, Zhou Yuanshan. The 3 pillars of the giant group had all expressed their support. Li Tianlan breathed a sigh of relief and whispered, "The cabinet." The deputy prime minister of the cabinet? Taking over Wu Jingmin's position? Wu Jingmin taking over Hua Jingyang's position? In that case, Bai Zhanfang frowned. If this operation was successful, the new group would have a great influence in the cabinet. But in this way, the position of the head of the cabinet would become more sensitive than it was now. "What do you think of the prime minister's position?" Bai Zhanfang said slowly. Li Tianlan was silent for a while and whispered, "Wen Xiyun." Chapter 900. Wen Xiyun, chairman of Beihai, Wen Xiyun. More than a year ago, it was almost certain that it would be very difficult for Wen Xiyun to become the new director. But more than a year ago, or even earlier, Wen Xiyun was the candidate that the Southeast Group was going to promote as the new prime minister. If it weren't for the constant turmoil of the Southeast Group and the Wang family of Beihai in recent years, Wen Xiyun would have become the new prime minister without any suspense. With the turmoil of the Southeast Group, there was an obvious vacancy in the position of prime minister, so this position had become the most competitive position at this time. Bai Zhanfang thought about it and glanced at Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi frowned slightly, deep in thought. "Not bad." Dongqing Hongguang suddenly laughed with some appreciation in his voice. Dongqing Wudi smiled bitterly. It was really good, but it didn't mean that the next thing would be simple. Pushing Wen Xiyun to be promoted would definitely get the strong support of the Southeast Group, and he would also get the Southeast Group's return. Wu Jingmin's matter would no longer be a problem, and Bai Qingqian's position could basically be confirmed. The only thing he had to consider was that after Wen Xiyun entered the cabinet, he would not be easy to deal with in the future. Compared to the aggressive Qin Fangqing, Wen Xiyun's personality was more stable. His foresight might be slightly inferior to Chen Fangqing's, but his ability to control the overall situation was stronger. If Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian could become the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister respectively, the new group would become extremely powerful in the cabinet. However, if Wen Siyuan became the Prime Minister, Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian would definitely be greatly constrained at some point. After all, the cooperation between the giant group and the Southeast group was in the honeymoon period, but in essence, it was a mutual benefit. After the election next year, both sides would calm down and the cooperation would naturally end naturally. At that time, the cabinet, whether it was the Southeast group represented by Wen Siyuan or the new group, would constantly check and balance each other, and neither side would be too comfortable. However, promoting Wen Siyuan was the plan with the least resistance. Although it would be troublesome, it was the most acceptable situation for the new group. The problem was, what would Hua Jingyang do if Wen Siyuan became the head of the cabinet? At present, Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai declared war on the prince group. The support of the academics was quite important, so they would also be the final winner. They had to reap their own benefits. Hua Jingyang's arrangement couldn't be too bad. If the most important balance couldn't be achieved, such a transaction naturally wouldn't go smoothly. If that's the case, Hua Jingyang won't have a suitable position. Zhou Yuanshan said thoughtfully. Yes and no. Bai Zhanfang shook his head. Li Huaqing, Dongqing Wudi, Hua Jingyang, Wu Jingmin, Yi Dongxing, Wang Qinglei, Zhou Yunhai, Guo Wenyin. After the election, 8 of the 9 directors had been confirmed. Among them, Li Huaqing, Dongqing Wudi, Hua Jingyang, Guo Wenyin and Zhou Yunhai were re-elected. Among the 5 people, the positions of Li Huaqing, Dongqing Wudi, and Zhou Yunhai could not be changed. There were only a few positions. If Hua Jingyang did not control the cabinet, he would have very little choice. Zhou Mulin's position in the council could hardly satisfy the academics. To Hua Jingyang, that position was a step backward. Hua Jingyang would not be satisfied with Guo Wentian's position in the National Assembly either. If he couldn't become the prime minister, he would basically have to choose one of the 2 positions occupied by the Wang family of Beihai. Only in this way, along with some other compensations, would there be a possibility of the Academy accepting it. Department of Supervision, or the Vice President of Human Resources. Those 2 positions were what the Giant Group and the Southeast Group could offer but didn't want to. No matter which position Hua Jingyang took, it would not be less helpful to Li Huaqing than if Hua Jingyang became the Prime Minister. If he became the Vice President, then Li Huaqing and Hua Jingyang would cooperate and hold the personnel power of Zhongzhou State tightly. This influence would not dissipate easily even after he retired. Go to the Department of Supervision? The Department of Supervision was in charge of the violations of all officials in Zhongzhou State. If Hua Jingyang took this position, it meant that the Vice President of Human Resources was someone else. It would probably be Wang Qinglei. In this way, the candidate of the Ministry of Personnel would inevitably be Li Huaqing's confidant. In addition, Hua Jingyang of the Department of Supervision, one was in charge of the appointment of national officials, and the other was in charge of the violations of national officials. It was enough to make people's scalps tingle when they thought about it. Should I make an appointment with the people of the Southeast Group and have a talk? Dongqing Wudi leaned on the sofa and whispered to himself. I'll go to the Wang family of Beihai after a while. Li Tianlan lowered his head and said lightly, I'll talk to Wang Xingxiao. Dongqing Wudi nodded. I'll find a chance to communicate with the president. He took a deep breath and shook his head slightly. Next year's election was almost the most complicated in recent decades. The rise of the new group would impact the pattern of the entire Zhongzhou state. How to form a situation acceptable to all parties was a test of everyone's wisdom. Dongqing Wudi rubbed his forehead and suddenly said, When will you go to Beihai? It depends. Li Tianlan whispered, In the next few days, all the problems of Haoyue group will be exposed and fully affect the Prince group. Military counselor is talking to some people in the Prince group. If it goes well, there will be a second voice in the Prince group. In addition, Minister, the accountability of the Beijiang military region will also begin. Everyone in the Beijiang military region who died in the battle can't become a martyr. Dongqing Wudi nodded and said solemnly, I've sent an investigation team down. If the tens of thousands of people in the Beijiang military region who died in the battle this time couldn't become martyrs, then it could be imagined how disappointed other people in the Beijiang military region would be, and how disappointed the important military figures who belonged to the prince group would be. Li Tianlan wanted to make the entire prince group completely split step by step. Chen Fangqing won't sit still. Dongqing Wudi said slowly. Of course. Li Tianlan nodded and said with a sneer, his only way now is to resist the pressure to destroy the Wang family of Beihai. If he succeeds, the southeast group will fall apart and the Wang family of Beihai will be completely destroyed. With huge benefits, all of us will focus on the southeast group, and the prince group can also take advantage of this opportunity to enhance its strength, so he will definitely contact those foreign forces and speed up the advance of the final battle in Beihai. When there is clear news from Beihai, it will be the time for me to go to Beihai. The more Chen Fangqing wants to do, the more I will make him unable to do it. Dongqing Wudi smiled and said, during this time, stay in Yuzhou? I'll introduce some people to you. He had never thought that Li Tianlan would set up a new group. This was mainly because he didn't know the identity of military counselor. Therefore, the whole giant group was the team that Dongqing Wudi prepared for Li Tianlan. If there was no military counselor, Li Tianlan would be the leader of the giant group in the future. But now that military counselor had built a better team of the new group, Dongqing Wudi naturally had to speed up the transfer of part of the power of the giant group to the new group. Li Tianlan had never seen many of them, so it was a good opportunity to do so. Li Tianlan was silent for a moment and whispered, I plan to go back to Tian'an tomorrow. Go back to Tian'an. Emperor Dong's palace was his foundation. But since the appearance of Emperor Dong's palace, he seemed to have only been to Tian'an once. Li Tianlan laughed at himself and continued, the victims of the nightmare troop will be buried the day after tomorrow. I have to go back to see them off. Dongqing Wudi glanced at Li Tianlan and whispered, it's my duty. There's one more thing. Li Tianlan lowered his eyes slightly and whispered, military counselor is already looking for her. Minister, if possible, help me find Yuetong's whereabouts. Looking for Wang Yuetong. Zhou Yuanshan narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Tianlan seriously. Dongqing Wudi nodded and said, okay. Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. His laughter was very low and had a very strange tone to it. He looked up at Dongqing Wudi's eyes and said seriously, Minister, am I going too far? Dongqing Wudi's body stiffened for a moment. Why, Li Tianlan chuckled and said, aren't you going to say something? Dongqing Wudi moved the corner of his mouth and subconsciously glanced at Bai Qingqian beside him. Bai Qingqian clenched her hands and her face was a little pale. Bai Qingqian tried to speak. Li Tianlan suddenly interrupted her and said with a smile, no hurry, let's talk about it next time. He didn't wait for Bai Qingqian to say anything and turned his eyes to Zhou Yuanshan. Brother-in-law, I want to talk to you alone. Zhou Yuanshan was stunned and nodded. Okay. Let's go out first. Dongqing Wudi forced a smile, stood up and walked out of the study. His pace was a little hurried. Everyone left the study in turn. Only Zhou Yuanshan sat where he was. Bai Qingqian walked at the end. When she passed by Li Tianlan, she wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Li Tianlan moved his eyes away. Bai Qingqian forced a smile and seemed to reach out to touch Li Tianlan's head. But she finally withdrew her hand and left the study. Zhou Yuanshan watched all this quietly. He looked at Li Tianlan, whose face was a little complicated. Why don't you let them go on? He asked suddenly. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time and then whispered, does it make sense? Zhou Yuanshan nodded seriously. He hesitated and asked tentatively, are you suspecting something? Not suspecting. Li Tianlan nodded. I'm not a fool. I want to know an answer, but suddenly I feel, he paused and whispered, that's also good. Well, that's good. That's it. In the living room downstairs, Dongqing Qiuqi took her daughter Dongqing Yu out of the stroller and put her beside her. The baby, who was a few months old, had fallen asleep. Qin Weibai, Bai Yuming, and Dongqing Qiuqi were sitting on the sofa and chatting. Seeing Dongqing Wudi come out first, Qin Weibai and others stood up at the same time. "Minister, where's Tianlan?" Qin Weibai asked softly. Dongqing Wudi forced a smile and said softly, "He's chatting with Yuan Shan." Qin Weibai nodded and said yes. Looking at Dongqing Hongguang and Bai Qingqian who came out later, she smiled and said, "I'll wash the fruit for you." "Boss Qin." "Little Bai." Dongqing Wudi and Bai Qingqian spoke at the same time. They were husband and wife, but they called her by different names. Qin Weibai said and looked back at the two. Dongqing Wudi took a deep breath and said softly, "Thank you." Qin Weibai smiled and said nothing. Bai Qingqian came over, took Qin Weibai's hand, stared at her dreamy perfect face, and said softly with a smile, "Stay tonight and chat with me." Qin Weibai hesitated. She wanted to say that it depended on Li Tianlan, but when the words came to her mouth, she nodded and said, "Okay." Dongqing Wudi looked away and said softly, "From now on, you and Tianlan will stay in Tianan and take care of him. We are all at ease with you by his side." He paused, as if he didn't know if it was appropriate for him to say this, but he shook his head and continued with a smile, "Of course, if he bullies you and feels wronged, you can tell your aunt at any time. You can also tell me and we can help you teach. No, we can talk to him." Qin Weibai took a deep look at Dongqing Wudi. A slight smile bloomed from the corner of her mouth. She held Bai Qingqian's hand, nodded to Dongqing Wudi, and said with a smile, "Thank you, Dad." Dongqing Wudi's body suddenly stiffened. Bai Qingqian's body trembled and subconsciously held Qin Weibai's hand. She lowered her head, and her eyes turned red for a moment. Chapter 901. Weak and soft lights filled the somewhat dark hall, and the inconspicuous light illuminated all the important corners of the hall. Huge and sophisticated instruments were placed in a disorderly manner, connected to screens. In the middle of the hall, there was a row of utensils that could be used for people to lie in. Strictly speaking, this was the best nutrition chamber, or hibernation chamber, but just by looking at its appearance, it looked like a neatly arranged coffin. The air in the hall was cool, and it looked extremely clean and tidy. Countless instruments made a slight buzzing sound when they were in operation. The instruments that were always in operation, the cold and empty hall, and the continuous buzzing sound, all of this seemed to be completely frozen in the dark environment, like a frozen oil painting. On the left side of the hall was an elevator. At this moment, the arrow on the elevator screen slowly jumped down, and finally stopped completely. Primary authority confirmed, level 2 authority confirmed, highest authority confirmed, please enter the password. The voice in the elevator sounded in the hall at the same time. The password is correct, please enter your fingerprint. Activate the pupil recognition system. Please enter the password. The password is correct. Welcome, Doctor. In the mechanical electronic sound, the elevator door slowly opened. A young woman with short hair and a delicate face walked into the hall. Behind her on both sides were two middle-aged men with serious and rigorous temperaments. A middle-aged man immediately pressed a red button in the hall. At the same time, countless screens in the hall lit up almost at the same time, dispelling the darkness in the hall. Countless data slowly flowed on each screen. The young woman, who looked to be in her 20s, raised her head and looked at the huge screen in the center. A large amount of data was reflected in her charming silver pupils, and her expression was quiet, serious, and focused. Another middle-aged man took a folder and walked over, and said in a low voice, "Dr. Naylan, this is the key physical data of medical record number 2. The initial data was 3 days ago, and the last record was 6 hours ago." Naylan Shuriying, who had short hair and silver eyes, was quiet and focused, took the folder and the pen in the folder. The physical data recorded on the folder were simplified symbols that only professionals could understand. Naylan Shuriying drew on the more important symbols with a thoughtful look in her eyes. She quickly browsed through the folder in her hand, walked forward, and arrived in front of a hibernation chamber. The middle-aged assistant turned on the light button of the hibernation pod. Under the faint light, everything in the hibernation pod was immediately presented to Naylan Shuriying's eyes. Inside the hibernation chamber was a man who looked thin and short. Perhaps because he had been lying there for a long time, his hair was very long and looked extremely messy. It made his face look even paler. He was lying flat and was completely covered in a large amount of foam. He was so quiet that he looked like a lifelike human specimen. Nalan Shuriying looked at him for a while and remained silent. The man in the hibernation pod was so frail and small. Who would have thought that he was a big shot standing at the peak of the dark world before he fell into a coma? They were not at the peak of this era. They belonged to the peak of the Sword Emperor's era. There were chosen ones, half-step chosen ones, and the peak of the invincible realm in that era. His most powerful time was very short, but in that short period of time, he successfully killed Arsis, an expert at the peak of the invincible realm in the state of coronation, killed thousands of the most elite saint warriors of the Vatican, and he had even heavily injured the Sword Emperor, who had almost stepped into the ranks of geniuses. Situ Wanjia. The Vatican might not forget this name for a very long time. Nalan Shuriying shook her head slightly and looked at the small screens on the edge of the hibernation pod. His heartbeat was normal and his breathing was normal. She pressed a button, and an X-ray quickly appeared on an instrument on the other side. Nalan Shuriying took the X-ray and looked at it carefully for a while. Then she nodded and said, "His body has basically recovered. Tribulation was sent to Tianan about half a month ago. Yuzhou had basically determined his physical state, but they still couldn't wake him up. Emperor Dong's palace took the initiative to take Tribulation over and started the deepest level of treatment and observation. All the physical data showed that Tribulation's muscles had returned to normal, and his bones had begun to heal slowly. At present, he was close to the level of a normal person. But he was still unconscious." Nalan Shuriying looked at him and was silent for a while. Then she whispered, "Continue to observe." The two assistants froze for a moment and said subconsciously, "Observe?" In their original plan, if Tribulation's body was really normal but he couldn't wake up, the next thing they should consider was different levels of mental stimulation. "Observe first." Nalan Shuriying nodded and said, "His Highness Li Tianlan will come back in the near future. We'll see what he thinks then." The two assistants nodded and didn't say much. Nalan Shuriying handed the document in her hand to the assistant and walked to another hibernation pod. "How's the situation of medical record number 1? "Same as always," the assistant said with a bitter smile. "Her body is still slowly recovering, but in a short time, there is no hope of recovering to the level of a normal person. We often monitor her brain waves, and the data is even lower than that of medical record number 1. Her body is quite seriously damaged, and it can be said that she is infinitely close to death." Nalan Shuriying's footsteps paused. She shook her head and whispered, "You haven't seen a person who is really infinitely close to death." He came to the hibernation pod in the middle and turned on the light source. In the hibernation pod, Dongqing Rushi, who was covered with foam, closed her eyes and didn't move. Nalan Shuriying watched all this quietly. Her heart was heavy, and her body was a little cold. Dongqing Rushi had been in a coma for 2 years. Her body was indeed getting better, but there was still a long time before she really recovered and woke up. A very, very long time. It was so long that Nalan Shuriying couldn't even see hope. 2 years ago, Li Tianlan almost overturned the entire Beihai province. One of the most important contents of his deal with the Wang family of Beihai was to ask the Wang family of Beihai to completely cure Dongqing Rushi. So Nalan Shuriying was sent to Tianan by summer solstice with the most advanced equipment and a top medical team. But today, she was completely sure that the progress they had made could not satisfy Li Tianlan, who was about to return to Tianan. The situation in Beihai had been extremely tense. Nalan Shuriying was not sure whether Dongqing Rushi's condition would make the situation facing Beihai worse. She stared blankly at Dongqing Rushi, who was motionless in the hibernation pod, and was silent for a long time. "Observe closely." After a long time, she took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "I stay in the lab most of the time. If anything happens, tell me immediately." "Understood." The two assistants spoke at the same time. Nalan Shuriying nodded, walked aside, and turned on a computer that was connected to all the equipment. She took out a folder again and began to record the latest physical data of Dongqing Rushi and Tribulation. The two assistants were carefully inspecting the sophisticated equipment in the hall and doing their daily maintenance. No one spoke. The hall became quiet again. Without anyone noticing, the space in the dimly lit hall began to tremble slightly. The transparent air seemed to become a line. The tiny line continued to spread and spread to the side of Dongqing Rushi's hibernation pod. The whole air suddenly twisted for a moment. A man in black appeared beside Dongqing Rushi. The dense sword energy completely wrapped Dongqing Rushi's hibernation pod, and in an instant, it became an independent space. The fingers of the man in black shook slightly. More sword energy appeared outside the independent space. The sword energy shook the air and quickly turned into another hibernation pod made of pure sword energy. Nalan Shuriying unconsciously raised her head and glanced in the direction of Dongqing Rushi. The hibernation pod was still there, and the light was still on. She sighed softly, lowered her head, and continued to copy the data. The man in black stood there quietly, looking down at Dongqing Rushi, who seemed to have no breath of life in the hibernation pod, with a complicated look in his eyes. It was a kind of complicated look that contained countless emotions: blame, love, helplessness, guilt, and bitterness. He gently put his palm on the hibernation pod, slightly narrowed his eyes, and laughed self-deprecatingly. Why didn't you ever think? Why did Jade Pool give you the silent sword? Why didn't you ever think that it was abnormal for the Dongqing clan to brainwash you again and again for so many years? Silence gave you the destructive power of the invincible realm when you were in the thunder-shocking realm, at the cost of your own life. After so many years of brainwashing, plus silence, how obvious is that? The Dongqing clan just wanted to keep you by his side, to use you as his most powerful safeguard before he grew up. In East Island, I stopped you from drawing the sword for the first time. Didn't you realize something? I'm disappointed. His voice gradually deepened. I'm disappointed in you. Dongqing Rushi, who was in the hibernation pod, didn't move. So stupid, the man in black breathed a sigh of relief and sneered. Your mother betrayed me for you. Why did you do that? You're not even as good as her. You made yourself like this. Who came to see you in the past 2 years? What did you get for lying down for 2 years? If I give you another chance, I don't know if you'll regret it. The man in black stared at Dongqing Rushi deeply and said in a low voice, Is it worth it? If this is a deal, I don't think it's fair. He whispered to himself, and his eyes fell on the heart rate detector screen of the hibernation pod. Looking at the numbers on the screen, he was silent for a long time. I'm disappointed. He spoke again. Dongqing Rushi didn't respond, and she was destined not to give any response. The man in black laughed softly. You're willing to die for him, so he should be willing to die for you. Only in this way it's fair. He straightened his body bit by bit and said in a calm voice, I'll send him down and wait for you. What do you say? Chapter 902. In the quiet hall, Nalan Shuriying slowly stood up. She recorded the latest body data of Dongqing Rushi and Tribulation respectively, planning to leave here and go to her own lab to study. The subtle and imperceptible sword energy space began to separate layer by layer. The black-clothed man silently followed Nalan Shuriying into the elevator. The elevator slowly went up 15 meters underground. He entered the password 3 times on the way and finally came to the surface. The elevator opened, and Nalan Shuriying walked out and went in another direction. The black-clothed man, who was calm and indifferent, seemed to have no emotions and aura, glanced at Nalan Shuriying and slowly walked out of the elevator. Outside the elevator was an incredibly grand hall. The length of thousands of meters was divided into rooms. In the central area, there was a rockery, a fish pond, and a small garden. The huge space and the nearly 20-meter-high dome made the whole hall look magnificent. Standing in it, everyone could feel their own insignificance. It was not a hall, but a small square. The black-clothed man watched quietly. In his sight, the combatants and civil servants of Emperor Dong's palace kept coming in and out, in 2s and 3s, constantly talking about something. There were not many people in Emperor Dong's palace, so this very advanced hall seemed extremely empty. The black-clothed man stood there for a while, then silently moved forward and walked out of the main entrance of the hall. The main entrance of the hall was a huge fountain square. Thousands of fountains were constantly spraying transparent water columns. The water columns rose tens of meters into the sky and converged in the center. A majestic and awe-inspiring pitch-black greatsword stood in the center of the water column. The greatsword was as tall as the huge castle behind the black-clothed man. Countless splashes of water slowly flowed on the greatsword, sparkling with colorful rays of light under the sunlight. The black-clothed man's mouth twitched. He had almost never seen such a large fountain square. Not to mention in Tianan, even in Yuzhou, a fountain square of this scale could almost be regarded as a landmark. He narrowed his eyes, smiled self-mockingly and whispered, "This is really the style of a nouveau riche." His figure directly passed by the fountain square, straight ahead, and stepped on a verdant lawn. There was a group of white pigeons that were not afraid of humans on the lawn. Several young women of Emperor Dong's palace seemed to be feeding the pigeons on the lawn during the break. The white pigeons fluttered their wings and landed on their palms to peck the corn in their palms, causing a burst of crisp and energetic laughter. A large golden retriever lay lazily in the middle of the lawn. Before the man in black could approach, the big dog that was lying lazily in the grass had already straightened its body and was looking straight in the direction of the man in black. The black-clothed man's body suddenly stiffened. He felt awkward and incredulous at the same time. He looked at the golden retriever in front of him, confused. He couldn't understand how the golden retriever had discovered him. The seemingly docile big dog slowly arched its body and let out a low growl, as if it would pounce at any moment. The man in black frowned. The sword chi around him vibrated slightly. The golden retriever's tail suddenly stood up, and its body tensed up to the extreme. "It can't see me, but it can feel the surrounding sword chi?" The man in black frowned. His figure flickered, and he instantly passed by the golden retriever. The golden retriever whimpered and turned around twice. It seemed to be a little confused. It ran around for a while, and it seemed to feel no danger. It whimpered and lazily patted down again. "What the hell is going on?" the man in black muttered to himself. He passed by the lawn and stepped on a wide arch bridge. Under the arch bridge was a clear stream. The circulating water surrounded the entire Emperor Dong's palace. It was a huge artificial lake. The man in black stood at the other end of the bridge and looked back at Emperor Dong's palace. The huge 6-story castle of Emperor Dong's palace was facing the pitch-black giant sword in front of the gate. It was like a giant standing in front of a hill, so tall and majestic, with a large shadow that almost blocked the sun. The man in black glanced at it expressionlessly, then turned around and left. His figure was getting farther and farther away. On the edge of the magnificent and huge Emperor Dong's palace was a busy construction site. It was very noisy. Construction teams from different places were busy with their own work. The place where the black-robed men were supposed to be building an office building. Were they planning a camp further away? Or a canteen? It was destined to become the area of Emperor Dong's palace in the future. But at present, the construction site was much larger than the already built Emperor Dong's palace. The man in black could clearly feel the footsteps and ambitions of Emperor Dong's palace. It was destined to be the center of Emperor Dong's palace in the future, and the entire Xinyuan city would be absorbed by Emperor Dong's palace bit by bit. Shopping malls, schools, hospitals, supermarkets, clubs, everything in the city would become a part of Emperor Dong's palace. There would no longer be ordinary citizens here. The residents here would be the staff of Emperor Dong's palace, the combatants, and their families. The city would become Li Tianlan's private territory, with a small population, a comfortable environment, luxurious facilities, a lot of funds, and citizens of the city. Many years later, it would inevitably become one of the most beautiful cities in Zhengzhou State, one of the most prosperous cities, and the city with the strongest concentration of residents. That was the new city plan. It was a plan that basically copied the ideas of the Wang family of Beihai, but it summarized some defects of Mount Dibing, so it became more perfect in the later stage. The man in black walked out of the construction site and looked at the city that was changing almost every day. He was silent for a long time. That was the scene of his dream. It was also the future that he had fantasized about a long time ago. It was also the future that a wealthy family that could maintain aggression against all forces and countries and unite around a hegemon-level country should have in his mind. He had imagined many times a scene similar to that of Emperor Dong's palace today. But he couldn't do it, even if he now controlled the Purgatory of Heaven capital. Even if the Purgatory of Heaven capital was still a superpower in the dark world. But no money. That was the most painful point. Li Guangtu, dressed in black, had a twisted and complicated expression. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was equivalent to the former Li family. But the former Li family did not represent the Purgatory of Heaven capital. The Purgatory of Heaven capital, which collapsed and gathered again, did inherit a lot of things from the Li family, including wealth, talents in all aspects, and powerful warriors, but after all, it was not the complete Li family. He had lurked in East Island for many years and accumulated a lot of wealth. Li Guangtu was rich. An investment of hundreds of millions or even billions was not a problem for him. He could even get tens of billions. But compared with Li Tianlan, the little money he had made him look like a pauper. When he first heard about the new city plan, it was like a joke. The income generated by the 5 countries in Eastern Europe was indeed terrifying, and the Flourishing Age Fund had invested a lot in Emperor Dong's palace. Under normal circumstances, Li Tianlan was not short of money. But no one believed that Emperor Dong's palace could really start the new city plan. The establishment of Xianyuan City was like a signal. Donghuang in the shortest time possible, the palace had invested all of its financial resources into Xianyuan City. Money was consumed crazily and Xianyuan City continued to develop. Even during the period when Zhongzhou State gradually reduced its support for Xianyuan City, Emperor Dong's palace did not stop. Where did the money come from? This was the question that puzzled Li Guangtu the most. The professionals of the Purgatory of Heaven capital had already made professional statistics. Even if the interests of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe were beyond imagination, Emperor Dong's palace could not mobilize such a huge amount of funds. As Zhongzhou State's attitude became clearer, the wealthy families that invested in Emperor Dong's palace became more cautious. Such a situation was bound to cause a break in the capital of Emperor Dong's palace. But here was the problem. Not only did Emperor Dong's palace not have a problem with its funds, but they could mobilize more and more money. This could be seen from the overall transformation of Xianyuan City. The construction and expansion of Emperor Dong's palace and the overall transformation of Xianyuan City. In nearly a year, Changning Qianqing, Xianyuan City, launched dozens of large-scale projects in a row. They really did not consider the problem of a break in the capital. In fact, their capital did not break. The Purgatory of Heaven capital had not figured out where the money came from. But today, where the money came from was no longer important. What mattered was that the new city plan of Emperor Dong's palace was actually possible to be realized. At this rate, it would take at most 5 years. 5 years later, Xianyuan City would become a complete Emperor Dong's palace. With all kinds of resources coming in continuously, it meant that in 6 or 7 years at most, the whole Tiannan would become the back garden of Emperor Dong's palace. What everyone did not know or subconsciously ignored was Li Guangtu's current martial arts. To be exact, it was the secret that he suddenly appeared after many years of dormancy. In the past 2 decades, in everyone's impression, the biggest traitor in Zhongzhou State had already fallen. Summer Solstice had resisted Li Guangtu's attack with a murderous weapon at the cost of her martial arts foundation. While destroying the murderous weapon, she had almost completely destroyed Li Guangtu's martial arts foundation. He had completely fallen under the siege of several invincible realm experts and many experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. This was everyone's impression. No one knew that he could recover, lurk in East Island, and set up the Purgatory of Heaven capital. When the Purgatory of Heaven capital first appeared, deity, who could compete with Wang Tianzong, could be said to be brilliant. But except for a few people, no one knew the true identity of deity. His identity was completely exposed in the chaos in Eastern Europe 2 years ago. But with the eternal sword above Mormons ending Wang Tianzong, that era had come to an end. Maybe someone would pay attention to Wang Tianzong. But there were very few people who paid attention to Li Guangtu. There were even fewer people who paid attention to Li Kuangtu's martial arts. Almost no one wanted to know how Li Kuangtu could set foot on the peak of the invincible realm when his foundation was almost ruined. The martial arts that Li Kuangtu had been exposed to since he was a child was the 24 moves of sword. The 24 moves of sword of the Li family. But it also contained a lot of the strengths of the Wang family of Beihai and the Lin clan's martial arts. All his martial arts foundation had completed a most desperate nirvana when the foundation was almost completely ruined. He embarked on his own path when he was in the worst state. The longevity seal and the immortal seal. The inspiration absorbed from the 24 moves of sword transformed into a new unique technique, which became the key to reshaping his foundation. The most important thing was that he used to have the dragon vein, although it was only a part of the dragon vein. Now, although his dragon vein had inexplicably disappeared, a large amount of vitality was still nourishing his flesh and blood. Powerful recovery ability. Martial arts that reshaped the foundation. All of this meant that no matter how serious his injury was, as long as he was not dead, he could recover faster than others and other experts at the same level. In the chaos in Eastern Europe, he was the first to wake up from a coma. He stayed in Tiannan for 2 years and didn't make a move. Everyone thought that his injury was serious, or even completely destroyed. He stood in the darkness where no one could see and silently recovered from his injury. His injury was more serious than that of Lin Fengting. But today, his state was even slightly better than Lin Fengting's. Those injuries had not healed yet. But now he was the real #1 expert in the dark world. Li Kuangtu was not in a hurry. He was not in a hurry at all. He felt that he still had enough time. The game between Beihai, Zhongzhou State, and the giant group had been in a stalemate. One advanced and the other retreated, and the three parties were trying their best to maintain a balance. Before the result of the game came out, it was difficult for Li Tianlan to get out of the desert prison. And at Li Tianlan's age and physical condition, it was almost impossible for him to enter the invincible realm. In Li Kuangtu's view, such a game would not have a relatively clear result until after next year's election at the earliest. In other words, he had at least a year to keep a low profile and recuperate. It was difficult for him to be sure that he would recover in a year, but he had his advantages. The longevity seal and the immortal seal were enough to make his state better in the next year and further get rid of Lin Fengting, who was also recovering. At that time, he would undoubtedly have more confidence. Even if there were any accidents in the middle, the time of the game would be further extended. Li Kuangtu had already begun to think of ways to intervene in the internal game of Zhongzhou State, intending to create some chaos. But he never thought that Qin Fangqing would be so stupid as to start a bullshit termination plan. The most ridiculous thing was that the plan was completely exposed not long after it started. Li Kuangtu, who was not mentally prepared, was completely dumbfounded as he watched all of this develop rapidly. Before anyone could react, the academics had successfully withdrawn, and Qin Fangqing, who was in control of the game, directly began his most intense means. He no longer paid attention to the so-called balance, nor did he care about the impact in the future. Therefore, because of the withdrawal of the academics, Qin Fangqing, who had no choice, blocked the desert prison in an extremely radical way. The game had become a real war. There was no doubt that Qin Fangqing lost. He might not be a complete failure now. But Li Tianlan always came out of the desert prison, and the shocking sword over the desert meant that the giant group and the southeast group had achieved a stage victory in this war. Haoyue group had an accident. Special warfare group had an accident. All this was Li Tianlan and Wang Xingxiao's counterattack. The subsequent development was almost not difficult to guess. Li Kuangtu couldn't understand why Qin Fangqing was so stupid. Maybe he was not stupid, but from the moment the termination plan was exposed, he had no choice. The termination plan was not a mistake. The only mistake was that it was exposed. Li Kuangtu didn't bother to think about the inside story. The reality was in front of him. He had wanted to wait a little longer. But Li Tianlan's strength was beyond his expectation. According to Li Tianlan's current growth rate, in less than 3 years, even if he recovered from his injury, he might not be able to defeat Li Tianlan. Not to mention 3 years later, even now, Li Tianlan had Xianyuan Feng in his hand. In the case that Xianyuan Feng had sufficient energy, he was not sure that he could win. This was a terrible thing. For Li Guangtu, this was even the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing. Once he couldn't defeat Li Tianlan or was suppressed by Li Tianlan, he could imagine what would happen to him. Everything that belonged to him would be taken away by Li Tianlan. Because they were all from the Li family. For many people in the purgatory of heaven capital, their sense of belonging was actually the same. There were not many people who were loyal to Li Tianlan. There were also not many people who were loyal to Li Guangtu. Most people in the purgatory of heaven capital had a sense of belonging to the Li family. Once he was left behind by Li Tianlan, with his infinite future possibilities, he could almost make Li Guangtu lose everything in the shortest time. So Li Guangtu didn't want to wait, and he didn't dare to wait. He had planned to wait a few more years. When Emperor Dong's palace completely swallowed up Xianyuan City and when everything in Emperor Dong's palace was completed, as long as he killed Li Tianlan, he could take over everything left by Li Tianlan in the shortest time and become the new Emperor Dong. This meant that he could get a whole city, a city built with a lot of money that he didn't even dare to imagine. If the purgatory of heaven capital got the complete Emperor Dong's palace and Xianyuan City, it was almost equivalent to getting the whole Tianan. The purgatory of heaven capital would become the most terrifying force in the dark world. But Li Tianlan's speed of growth made him dare not delay at all. Under the sun, Li Guangtu stood on the edge of the construction site, muttered something to himself silently, and then shook his head. He stood there and waited for a minute. A pitch-black Passat slowly drove over. If it was in Tianan 2 years ago, it could be said to be an absolute luxury car. But in the current Xianyuan city, it was a completely inconspicuous ordinary car. Li Guangtu sat in the car, rubbed his forehead, and let out a long sigh. How's Moon God? The driver was Daybreak, another invincible realm expert of the purgatory of heaven capital. His injury had completely recovered, but he hadn't stabilized his realm for the time being. His powerful aura was constantly fluctuating. Not good. Li Guangtu whispered, very not good. His voice was a little depressed. Daybreak was silent for a while, started the car and whispered, it's not necessarily hopeless. I've heard of Silver Eyes in Beihai. She can be regarded as an authoritative figure in this field. Now the cooperation between Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace is at a critical period. Even if it's to please Li Tianlan, the Wang family of Beihai will inevitably work harder to let Silver Eyes save Moon God. It's a good thing to let her stay here for the time being. She's too slow. Maybe I should talk to the Wang family of Beihai, of course, after the final battle. Li Guangtu narrowed his eyes. After the final battle, he would kill Li Tianlan and annex Emperor Dong's palace before Zhongzhou state reacted. And after the final battle, if Li Tianlan died, the current situation in Zhongzhou state would be different again. Daybreak was silent for a while and didn't speak. How's Dawn doing in East Island? Li Guangtu suddenly asked. Everything is going well. Daybreak nodded. My Shiranui is very cooperative. At present, Dawn has regained control of Liuhua Palace. In Heaven Capital, our pawns have been activated. At present, we can be sure that in order to recapture the south of Beihai Province, East Island will invest a considerable part of its power in this final battle. Their interior will inevitably be empty. With the cooperation of Liuhua Palace, we can get back part of the power of East Island. Liuhua Palace was a name that had been dim in the dark world for several years. It was also a martial arts force that was as famous as Wuji Palace and Jifeng Sword Training School a few years ago. Shinichi Miyamoto, the palace master of Liuhua Palace, was also recognized as the peak ninja in the whole dark world. He controlled the most elite divine wind force in East Island. In terms of actual power, he was no less than Tianhai Wuji and Yagyu Kurasumi. But in the final battle of Heaven Capital 5 years ago, Shinichi Miyamoto of the Invincible Realm died in the hands of Tribulation. Therefore, Tribulation broke through and directly entered the Invincible Realm from the Chi-controlling realm. But Liuhua Palace never recovered. After the Purgatory of Heaven Capital entered East Island, my Shiranui, the young palace master, was the first to seek refuge with the Purgatory of Heaven capital. The sphere of influence of Liuhua Palace was maintained under the protection of the Purgatory of Heaven capital. As the Purgatory of Heaven capital gradually withdrew from East Island in the past 2 years, Liuhua Palace was annexed by the other 2 martial arts forces all the time. Now there was a chance to establish contact with the Purgatory of Heaven capital again. Mai Shiranui, who had no way out, had no chance to refuse. When the final battle takes place, go to East Island and kill all the Tom, Dick, and Harry. I'll see the result of the final battle and consider whether to talk to the Mikado of East Island. Li Kuangtu gently raised the corner of his mouth, and his smile was a little mocking. Daybreak was now an invincible realm superior. Together with Dawn and Phoenix, he would come to East Island with the elites of the Purgatory of Heaven capital. When East Island put most of its power into the final battle, they could sweep everything. After the final battle, in the worst case, the Purgatory of Heaven capital could regain control of East Island. The best case was to control the Zhongzhou state and the dark world of East Island, unify Tiannan, conquer the underground world of Southeast Asia, and establish a real dynasty. Li Kuangtu looked out of the window. His eyes were extremely bright, like 2 wildfires burning. Daybreak hesitated and said softly, "East Island won't be a big problem. I can go to Beihai with you." Li Kuangtu was silent for a while, then slowly shook his head and said, "It's not necessary." He was confident enough in his strength. Li Tianlan may not be able to take him down with Xianyuan Feng. Daybreak said calmly. Li Kuangtu laughed. "I'm not fighting with him alone. Xianyuan Feng is really strong, but it's just a murderous weapon in essence. Its energy will be exhausted. After all, in the final battle he will face more than one invincible realm expert. When Xianyuan Feng's energy is almost exhausted, I will make a move, and it will be enough to decide his life or death in an instant." Daybreak was silent for a while and held the steering wheel tightly. He glanced at Li Kuangtu through the rearview mirror, hesitated, and said softly, "Your Highness." Li Kuangtu glanced at him. "How much strength has he recovered now?" Daybreak asked softly. This was something that every high-level official in the Purgatory of Heaven capital was very concerned about. Everyone knew that Li Kuangtu recovered very fast in secret, and he was in a good state. This was also an important source of confidence for them to plot against East Island again. But no one knew how much Li Kuangtu had recovered. Li Kuangtu was silent for a while and said calmly, "In the normal state, I've recovered about 70%, which is about the same as my heyday before I went to Eastern Europe." Daybreak's eyes lit up. He went to the heyday of Eastern Europe. At that time, Li Kuangtu was a god, with the strength that could break through the peak of the invincible realm at any time. This was Li Kuangtu's normal state now. Li Kuangtu smiled and continued to say, "If necessary, I can exert about 90% of my strength in a short time, which is enough to deal with any situation." Li Kuangtu's 90% strength now, this was not his peak state now. But it had definitely surpassed the limit of the peak of the invincible realm. Daybreak was silent for a while and laughed. "Then I'll go back to East Island." He was talking about going back to East Island. Not going there. He was going back to the territory that used to belong to him. Li Kuangtu nodded and whispered, "We'll get back everything we lost." Chapter 903. When he walked out of the train station of Xianyuan City, Wang Lin even thought that he had come to the wrong place. In his initial impression, Xianyuan City should have been a small city belonging to Annan State. After it was split, it became one of the cities belonging to Tiannan State. Tiannan had always been in a state of chaos, with undercurrents surging. It had never been peaceful. This small city, originally called Tunan, was full of destruction, crime, violence, and barbarism. The population here was getting smaller and smaller, and the city was getting more and more dilapidated. Every street and every road in the urban area should be full of decay and depression. This was the Tunan city in Yuan Lin's impression. After Tunan city became Xianyuan City, Zhongzhou State, Emperor Dong's palace, and many wealthy families and investment institutions in Zhongzhou State invested a lot of money here. In various reports, the new Xianyuan city was changing rapidly. Yuan Lin had read many reports submitted to the cabinet. In his impression, the so-called rapid change should just barely get rid of the previous appearance of Tunan City. At most, it should be a little better than Tunan City. It should be almost the same as a county in the inland of Zhongzhou State. At most, it should be a relatively well-developed county. After all, how could a small city with a very poor foundation develop so fast in 2 years? But the moment he walked out of the station, the scenes in front of him suddenly made him a little absent-minded. There were indeed no high-rise buildings like those in Huading, Yuzhou, in Xinyuan City. The buildings here were relatively low, but absolutely did not feel the slightest sense of dilapidation. They were all obviously newly built buildings. Every building had a different style, and they were arranged neatly. There was an exaggerated distance between the buildings, but they were not empty. They were all filled with lawns and gardens, and in the middle of the lawns and gardens, there were clean and tidy paths paved with stone slabs, quiet and tidy. Between the buildings on both sides were wide and somewhat incredible streets. The smooth streets stretched all the way to the end of the site. Perhaps it was because the south was relatively warm. Even in winter, flowers were still blooming on the green belt that isolated the sidewalks and driveways. Under the bright sun, the fresh air with almost no industrial pollution blew over. Both the vehicles and the pedestrians in sight were indescribably leisurely. No, it was not leisurely. Yuan Lin was stunned for a long time before he realized the problem. As the first deputy director of the cabinet office and the chief secretary of the prime minister, he spent most of his time in Yuzhou or inspecting various places in Zhongzhou State with Chen Fangqing. He traveled to many places. However, he had never seen a city like Xinyuan City. The biggest difference was the population density. There were very few people in Xinyuan City. It was so little that it was hard to believe. There was no heavy traffic, no dense flow of people. The wide streets, the beautiful city, the fresh air, and the almost cold population made everything in the city look very leisurely. It was an indescribable feeling of comfort. Is this really Tiannan? Tiannan Xinyuan City? Yuan Lin was dumbfounded. He walked out of the station in a daze and walked forward in a daze. Only when the person in charge of receiving him greeted him did he manage to regain his senses. Hello, Director Yuan. I'm Xiao Su from the police department. At the exit, a tall and straight young man wearing gold-rimmed glasses smiled warmly and respectfully reached out his hands to shake hands with Yuan Lin. Yuan Lin came back to his senses and took a deep breath. His tone was inexplicably low. Let's go. Xiao Su nodded and took the luggage from Yuan Lin's hands. She said softly, the car is in the underground car park. Yuan Lin grunted in acknowledgement and followed little Su down the elevator. The underground car park was also huge and clean with soft lights. There were not many cars parked inside, but it made Yuan Lin a little dazed again. As far as the eye could see, the sparse cars parked in various positions were basically all less than 300,000 yuan. 300,000 yuan was considered a small amount, and there were no less than 500,000 yuan. Yuan Lin looked at the Hyundai in front of Xiao Su. No matter how he looked at it, it felt shabby. This was Xinyuan City. This was Xinyuan City? Yuan Lin blinked his eyes. Everything was like a dream. He sat in the back of the car in silence. The sense of superiority in his heart had disappeared without a trace. The black Hyundai slowly left the car park, out of the station, and drove into the wide streets of Xinyuan City. Yuan Lin quietly looked at everything outside the window. Exquisite buildings, huge spacing, and sufficient greenery. The willfulness of Xinyuan City could be seen everywhere. No country could make such an extravagant urban planning. This was almost not a city, but a luxurious and exquisite huge garden. With such an exaggerated design style, how many people could this city accommodate after it was built? He had seen the urban planning submitted by the Xinyuan City Hall in the cabinet. The new Xinyuan City was about 6,500 square kilometers. Such a city area was not large. Compared with Yuzhou, which was 17,000 square kilometers, the area of Xinyuan City was only a little more than 1/3 of Yuzhou. But Yuzhou had a population of more than 20 million. What about Xinyuan City? Yuan Lin was not an expert in this area. He could only make a rough judgment. Such a city plan could accommodate at most hundreds of thousands of people. Using more than 1/3 of Yuzhou to accommodate hundreds of thousands of people, and it was not hundreds of thousands of people. 300,000 yuan. 400,000 yuan? What did it mean? Wang Lin took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "The development of Xianyuan City is really good." Yes, that's for sure. Only 1/5 of Xianyuan City has been completed. There are 5 districts in Xianyuan City, which are named simply North, South, East, West, and the city center. Now, most of the places in the city have basically been demolished. Working day and night, the entire Xianyuan City is basically a construction site. We are now in the North District, where the construction has just started. However, the reconstruction of the city center has been completed. Only after going there and taking a look will you know how exaggerated it is. If this goes on, when Xianyuan City is completed, the entire city can almost be said to be a luxury. Hearing this, Xiao Su smiled and said, "But that's the future, Yuan Hall. Everything that you can see now is equivalent to 1/5 of Xianyuan City." Only after a while, Wang Lin whispered to himself, "Where does the money come from? That's what our team leader wants to know." Little Su shrugged. Wang Lin did not speak anymore. He seemed to be trying to figure out the source of the money of Emperor Dong's palace. He was Chen Fangqing's secretary. Chen Fangqing was the prime minister, and the main person in charge of the financial department of Zhongzhou State must be his confidant. Zhongzhou State still attached great importance to the construction of Xianyuan City. In the past 2 years, there had been 3 appropriations, totaling nearly 40 billion yuan. But this number was obviously not enough to build a city with almost nothing. Judging from the current situation, it was not nothing at all, but Emperor Dong's palace didn't want anything at all, and even spent money to demolish and rebuild the original foundation. 40 billion yuan was not even enough for the most basic construction. Plus the interests of the 5 Eastern European countries, and the investment of the wealthy families, Wang Lin did not think that Emperor Dong's palace could build such a city. A city that could be described as a luxury. The black Hyundai drove into the city center in silence. Wang Lin watched quietly, and his heart became more and more numb. Exquisite buildings, huge statues, gorgeous street lights, lush greenery, a grand square, the Hyundai drove all the way and finally entered a small forest. Well, a small forest in the city center. The corner of Wang Lin's mouth twitched as if he was stimulated. The forest in the city center. He felt that the city center and the forest could not be connected at all. No matter how small this small forest was, it could be used to build at least a large residential area, a business circle, or there were too many choices. But Emperor Dong's palace willfully built here, or rather, preserved a forest. All the buildings around seemed to adapt to the style of this forest, and it did not look out of place as a whole. Wang Lin raised his head stiffly. The road in front of him slowly went up along a not obvious slope. At the highest point at the end of his sight was a pure white building like a castle. In a verdant forest, the castle was looming, with an indescribable pure beauty. The corner of Wang Lin's mouth twitched. He wanted to say something, but he swallowed it back. He had made up his mind to complain about Emperor Dong's palace when he returned to Yuzhou. This city was luxurious and beautiful beyond Wang Lin's imagination. But all of this meant nothing in his eyes. This was completely the capriciousness of the rich. To be exact, it was a reckless waste of resources. Hyundai kept going up. The pure white castle in front of him was getting closer and closer. Wang Lin opened his mouth little by little. He watched the castle getting higher and higher. The soft sound faintly echoed in the forest. His eyes widened. He was dumbfounded. He was really dumbfounded. This forest might be a hill preserved by Emperor Dong's palace. But the problem was that this pure white castle was not on the top of the mountain at all. It was a huge, exquisite, and luxurious castle. A castle floating in the air. It was really a castle in the air. It floated about 20 or 30 meters high in the air, gently rotating at an imperceptible speed. The doorman trotted over and opened the door respectfully. Wang Lin got out of the car and looked up, dumbfounded. From his point of view, he could see the huge base of the floating castle. The pure white base was engraved with countless patterns, forming a pattern of a clock. It was dusk, and night was approaching. The base of the castle was shining with gorgeous light, illuminating the whole top of the mountain dreamily. What was this? What the hell was this? Damn it. What was this? City in the Sky, the most high-end club in Tiannan. Su's tone was a little complicated. This is an industry belonging to Emperor Dong's palace, and Xianyuan City is the first one. According to their plan, in the next 1 or 2 years, branches of City in the Sky will be established in every first-tier and second-tier city in Zhongzhou State. The initial plan is to establish more than 50 similar clubs. Wang Lin swallowed hard and murmured, "How did they do it?" "The power of money and privilege." Little Su chuckled. Wang Lin watched this scene quietly. In a daze, he did not notice a black Passat slowly parking in the parking space near him. The doorman nearby wanted to run over and open the door. In the driver's seat, Daybreak waved his hand. He turned off the car, but did not get out. Instead, he looked at Wang Lin not far away. "The chief secretary of the cabinet?" Daybreak raised his eyebrows and laughed. "Why does he look like a bumpkin? Is he scared out of his wits? No, he doesn't know how to get up, does he? Does he want to fly up there? He must want to fly up. When did you become so mean?" Li Kuangtu glanced at him with a smile. Daybreak laughed and asked, "Your Highness, are you here to see him today?" Li Kuangtu leaned against the back of the chair and narrowed his eyes. "Maybe, but he's not the one who asked me out." Chapter 904. The City in the Air. The most high-end clubhouse in Xianyuan City. As the Prime Minister's chief secretary, Wang Lin was not a real bumpkin. He had been to so many so-called high-end clubhouses, but he had never seen such a bluffing clubhouse. It was a real floating castle. The whiteness was not dry, but a kind of warm and soft white that seemed to reflect light. The flickering light under the base of the castle was indescribably gorgeous in the gradually falling night. Wang Lin was silent for a long time before he whispered, "How does it fly?" "It's an optical illusion." Xiao Su whispered with a smile. "Under the castle is a new type of alloy, which has introduced the most advanced optical camouflage technology of Zhongzhou State. The alloy is mixed with a lot of invisible materials. The whole castle is basically made of white marble, which can provide a stable light source. The interior is reinforced by superalloys. In this state, whether it is day or night, the invisible alloy below can remain invisible, so it looks like this castle is floating in the air." "They are really daring," Wang Lin said with difficulty. The most advanced optical camouflage technology of Zhongzhou State was the technology of the Dongqing clan. It was still a secret and was basically used on some cutting-edge weapons. But Emperor Dong's palace used it to build a clubhouse? Even if they dare to think, they need money. This castle, together with nearly 5 tons of alloy below and some technology, cost more than 700 million. And there is a reason for this height. The height of the castle is 22 meters, which is just beyond the attack limit of ordinary chi-controlling realm and ice-condensing realm experts. There is also an automatic weapon system in the alloy below the castle. If it is fired at full force, enough firepower can even suppress a thunder-shocking realm expert for a short time. The security guards inside are all elites selected by Emperor Dong's palace. They rotate regularly. This clubhouse can be said to be the safest place in Xianyuan City, except for Emperor Dong's palace and the city hall. The membership fee is 100 million in the first year, and after a strict inspection, it is 30 million every year. Xiao Su shook his head and sighed with emotion. 100 million? Wang Lin gritted his teeth. There was no club in Zhongzhou State or even the whole world that dared to ask for an entrance fee of 100 million yuan. Moreover, there was an annual fee of 30 million after that. Xiao Su narrowed his eyes and nodded. It's said that it's the idea of the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai. She proposed the new city plan, and the city in the air is also a part of this plan. The membership fee of 100 million seems to be a lot, but according to our investigation over the past 2 years, we've received more than 200 applications to join, but less than 1/10 of them can really become members of the city in the air. The club will conduct a preliminary review, and the final decision on whether to accept a new member is in Emperor Dong's palace. What's the point? Yuan Lin's mind was still a little muddled. Various thoughts kept wandering in his mind, and eventually, he had no more thoughts. This is the alliance of Emperor Dong's palace. Xiao Su curled up the corner of his mouth. Pure financial resources are not enough to join the city in the air. One must have enough value. Emperor Dong's palace will gather all the members together to achieve a state similar to sharing resources, thus forming a diverse alliance. This is just the first club. Emperor Dong's palace plans to spread the city in the air all over the country. At that time, it may be divided into first-level clubs, second-level clubs, or even third-level clubs. Different levels have different thresholds, forming one interest circle after another around Emperor Dong's palace. The alliance of all levels will continue to run and create endless benefits for Emperor Dong's palace. Under such circumstances, the annual membership fee is not worth mentioning at all, because everyone can earn back several times or even dozens of times. Yuan Lin's expression changed. He was shocked and angry, and he said in a hoarse voice, "This is tantamount to squeezing the resources of Zhongzhou State to create benefits for Xinyuan City. If this alliance is big enough, it's almost equivalent to invasion. It's..." Xiao Su turned his head and glanced at Yuan Lin. His eyes were sharp and calm. "It can't be regarded as invasion." He lowered his voice and said softly, "Unless Hall Yuan regards Emperor Dong's palace as the enemy of Zhongzhou State." Yuan Lin's expression suddenly froze for a moment. Xiao Su took a deep breath and said no more. He took out a badge from his pocket and took Yuan Lin a few steps forward. The light at the base of the castle shrouded their bodies. The exquisite badge also shone. Under Yuan Lin's dumbfounded expression, a crack suddenly appeared in the empty air in front of him. The crack grew bigger and bigger and turned into a door. At the door was a simple but not monotonous grand hall. A row of young girls in uniforms smiled sweetly and said, "Welcome." Yuan Lin walked in silently and entered the elevator. The elevator went all the way up and officially entered the club. Yuan Lin, who was dazzled along the way, was led into a private room by a waiter. In the private room that looked like the study of a great European aristocrat in the Middle Ages, a middle-aged man with a cold face was looking at a notebook in front of him and typing quickly on the keyboard. He was obviously very familiar with Yuan Lin. When he heard the door open, he just glanced at it casually, nodded and said, "Sit down," and then continued to busy with the work at hand. Xiao Su poured a cup of tea for Yuan Lin and quietly left. Yuan Lin picked up the teacup and took a sip. In the rich tea fragrance, he finally regained his calmness. In the intensive typing sound, Yuan Lin glanced at him and asked, "Dahai, are you a member here?" "To be exact, I'm the first batch of members." Lu Dahai responded with no expression. They were college classmates, and they slept in the same dormitory. There was no need for any courtesy after many years of friendship. He shook his hand, picked up the teacup in front of him and took a sip. He sighed and said, "There are a total of 18 members in the city in the sky. I'm the first batch and the last one. To be exact, this place is not mine, but the cabinet's. I'm just using it temporarily." "Have you paid?" Yuan Lin raised his eyebrows. "Of course." Lu Dahai sneered, "A total of 100 million. It's a special fund approved by the cabinet. Xinyuan City is very confident now, so it's natural to collect money." "You have a lot of resentment," Yuan Lin said with a smile. "The cabinet pays for you to come here and enjoy. What are you dissatisfied with?" Lu Dahai typed a line of words on the keyboard. He seemed to be dissatisfied and then deleted it completely. He clicked the save button, turned off the computer, picked up a lot of materials, and sat on the sofa opposite Yuan Lin. "It's not resentment." His voice was low and dull. To be exact, it's dissatisfaction and a little fear. He opened the drawer and took out a box of free top-grade cigars provided by the club. He didn't speak for a long time. "Tell me the details." Yuan Lin glanced at him and said slowly. Lu Dahai was a typical scholarly cadre. Although he had a good relationship with Wang Lin, such a person would basically not be assigned to any group and become a confidant of a group. He didn't have a specific position in the cabinet. He was an investigator at the level of deputy governor. And in the past 2 years, Lu Dehai spent most of his time in Tiannan. To be exact, he was in Xianyuan City. He formed a research group with elites drawn from various departments. From the beginning to the present, they had been doing research in Xianyuan City. Some extremely important materials that didn't involve the secrets of Emperor Dong's palace were basically provided by Lu Dehai to Zhongzhou State. Obviously, Emperor Dong's palace also knew this. They didn't oppose or support the arrival of Lu Dehai, who didn't have the mark of a group. They completely pretended not to see him. In the past century, Lu Dehai had submitted more and more reports to the cabinet. In the beginning, he submitted 1 document a month, but now he submitted 3 or 4 documents a month. Basically, he submitted 1 document a week. Wang Lin had 2 purposes for coming here this time. First, he wanted to secretly meet with a big shot in Tiannan on behalf of Chen Fangqing. Second, he wanted to contact Lu Dehai and learn more about the current situation of Xianyuan City. Xianyuan City, Lu Dehai lit the cigar. In the smoke, he thought for a long time seriously and said slowly, "In the past 6 months, Xianyuan City has changed a lot. Everything you see now is basically built in the past 6 months. The city plan of the city hall has been submitted to the cabinet. It's only a part, not the whole. I've already said this in the report. Half a year ago, Xianyuan City was always being demolished. Except for the construction of Emperor Dong's palace, they only built an area near the city hall. I collected some relevant information and intelligence and carefully observed some investors who entered Xianyuan City. Then I asked Xiao Wang to make a relatively simple model, which can roughly analyze the financial resources of Emperor Dong's palace. Xiao Wang, you should know that I'm a senior investigator of the Ministry of Finance and I'm very professional in this aspect. Judging from the financial resources of Emperor Dong's palace half a year ago, their construction of Xianyuan City was relatively normal. That kind of construction speed allowed them to keep some relatively abundant funds. Lu Dehai took a puff of the cigar and said, "But the situation suddenly changed half a year ago. The city hall began to introduce all kinds of projects. The urban planning images were thrown out as if they had been prepared for a long time. The whole city was being demolished. The downtown area near the city hall changed day by day. Famous designers from all over the world were running to Xianyuan City. They gathered to design different buildings, streets, and greenery. The young mayor Ning of Xianyuan City said in an interview that he wanted the whole Xianyuan City to be a luxury. A large amount of money has been spent. Let me give you an example. Xianyuan City has been developing for 2 years. In the past 6 months, they have spent more money than the previous 1.5 years. Their expenditure is about 6 times more than the previous 1.5 years. In the past 6 months, some wealthy families have reduced the amount of investment in Xianyuan City under some pressure. The transfer of interests from the 5 countries in Eastern Europe has not increased significantly. Zhongzhou State has not allocated funds to Xianyuan City either. So where does the money come from? It's not a little more money out of thin air, but hundreds of billions of yuan out of thin air. According to the current situation, it may be more than hundreds of billions. Because the transformation of Xianyuan City is getting faster and faster, Emperor Dong's palace doesn't seem to worry about the lack of money at all. Such a huge amount of money means that there must be more than one top consortium behind Emperor Dong's palace supporting the development of Xianyuan City. Lu Dehai hesitated, and his voice was a little complicated. What I worry and fear most is whether the wealthy families secretly supporting the finance of Emperor Dong's palace and Xianyuan City are the wealthy families of Zhongzhou State. His voice was a little hoarse. If they are not, will the built Xianyuan City still be the Xianyuan City of Zhongzhou State? Wang Lin was shocked and looked up at Lu Dehai. Lu Dehai lowered his head and was strangely silent. In this case, it almost meant that Lu Dehai was accusing Emperor Dong's palace of treason and turning to foreign consortia. He thought about that possibility and shook his head subconsciously. Could it be the Wang family of Beihai? they definitely have the strength to do so. The financial situation of the Wang family of Beihai is very stable, and there has been no fluctuation in the past 2 years. Of course, they also paid for the construction of Xianyuan City, but most of their support for Xianyuan City comes from armaments. We can't rule out the possibility that the Wang family of Beihai secretly supports Emperor Dong's palace, but it's unlikely. Such a large amount of money is not a small amount for the Wang family of Beihai. It's illogical to give it to Emperor Dong's palace for nothing. So, you suspect the foreign consortia? Wang Lin was thoughtful. Half a year ago, this node was very critical. Everything in Emperor Dong's palace was normal, and I had no way to know the information about the desert prison and Li Tianlan. Lu Dehai said calmly. Li Tianlan. Half a year ago, Wang Lin thought of something. Military counselor went to the desert prison half a year ago. Who is military counselor? Lu Dehai narrowed his eyes. I don't know. Wang Lin shook his head. I'm not sure yet. Lu Dehai looked at Wang Lin silently for a while. Military counselor was the super master of Samsara Palace, not a member of the system of Zhongzhou State. How could such a person go to the desert prison? Then he thought of Dongqing Wudi and felt powerless. He shook his head and changed the topic, saying slowly, let's not talk about where the money comes from. The current plan of Xianyuan City doesn't seem to be building a city. Wang Lin glanced at him. It gives me the feeling that the development direction of Xianyuan City is completely like an independent kingdom, or a foundation that only belongs to Emperor Dong's palace, with the whole city as the foundation. Lu Dehai said. New city plan, I know. Wang Lin nodded. No, you don't know. Or, the reality is more exaggerated than you think, and much more exaggerated. Lu Dehai took a deep breath. He casually flipped through the information in his hand and confirmed the data. According to our research results, combined with their city planning map, most of the buildings in Xianyuan City are unscientific and unreasonable. To be exact, they waste a lot of resources. When you came here, you should have seen that there are no tall buildings in Xianyuan City, and the distance between buildings is almost extravagant. If this city is built, it can only accommodate 150,000 people, and the limit should not exceed 250,000. Compared with Yuzhou, the area of Xianyuan City can accommodate at least 8 to 10 million people, but here, the limit is only 200,000 people, which means that one person in Xianyuan City occupies the living space of dozens of people in Zhongzhou State. What's more, Emperor Dong's palace doesn't intend to let the population of this city reach the limit. Do you know what the most precious thing in Xianyuan City is now? It's not money, it's the household registration. The household registration of Xianyuan City in the future. The City Hall hasn't released any relevant information yet, but from various sources, Xianyuan City's requirements for household registration will be unbelievably strict. At present, there are countless families who want to join Xianyuan City and settle down here, but only a few families have been promised by the City Hall and can settle down here in the future. The City Hall is currently considering the problem of household registration, followed by the problem of social welfare. It can be foreseen that, like this city which is almost luxurious, the social welfare of Xianyuan City will also be so high that it will be stunning. The social welfare of Xianyuan City is also astonishingly high. Because of the small number of people in Xianyuan City, there are only a few 100,000 or 200,000 people in Xianyuan City. With the financial resources that Emperor Dong's palace has shown right now, they can even afford to live for free. Lu Dehai paused and suddenly said, Do you know what this means? Wang Lin's face was gloomy. He nodded and said, It means that Emperor Dong's palace hasn't considered things outside of Xianyuan City, including Zhongzhou State. Emperor Dong's palace first considers the environment of Xianyuan City and Tianan, and then Zhongzhou State. He narrowed his eyes and said coldly, The wolf's ambition is as clear as day. Some insider information shows that in the future, to join the household registration of Xianyuan City, one must first become a part of Emperor Dong's palace. That is to say, outsiders are not welcome here. In the whole city, in the long run, even in the whole province, as long as one is from Tianan, he must be a member of Emperor Dong's palace. This should be a recent change made by Emperor Dong's palace, not the original part of the new city plan. It may come from the military counselor of Samsara Palace, or the new patriarch of the Lin clan. It may also be Li Tianlan's own idea. They have learned from the game between Zhongzhou State and the Wang family of Beihai. Emperor Dong's palace wants to completely turn Tianan into a part of itself. It's naked, not as subtle as the Wang family of Beihai. A province. Everyone is a member of Emperor Dong's palace. At least one of their family members will work in Emperor Dong's palace. Emperor Dong's palace will build the best city, the most luxurious conditions, the highest social welfare. All of this is like a dream. I mean, if this scene is maintained, many years later, people in Tianan province will be immersed in this kind of life. They will be used to it. When Zhongzhou State treats Emperor Dong's palace like the Wang family of Beihai, what will happen to the people in Emperor Dong's palace whose best living conditions are destroyed? Yuan Lin's body trembled slightly. Lu Dehai's voice was a little difficult. Put yourself in their shoes, they will tear up all those who want to destroy their living environment like madmen, regardless of life or death, regardless of the consequences, at all costs. Yuan Lin suddenly felt a bone-chilling coldness. There was a long silence in the private room. Yuan Lin took a big drag on his cigar and reached out to take a pile of documents in front of Lu Dehai. It's a worthwhile trip. He forced a smile, sorted out the documents, and solemnly said, "When I go back, I will give these to the Prime Minister as soon as possible." Lu Dehai nodded and asked in confusion, "Aren't you going back now?" "I made an appointment to meet someone here." Yuan Lin smiled, looked down at his watch, and said, 10 minutes left. Lu Dehai immediately understood what he meant. He nodded and said, "Got it? I'll go first." Yuan Lin stood up with a smile and walked him to the door. Then he reached out to hold his old classmate's hand and said softly, "Thank you." After a pause, he continued with a smile, "But your time in Tianan shouldn't be too long." Lu Dehai smiled and turned to leave. Yuan Lin stopped smiling and returned to the private room with a heavy heart. He picked up the pile of documents and read them carefully. What he didn't want to admit was that there was a touch of fear in his heart. For him, the stronger Emperor Dong's palace was, the brighter the future would be, and the gloomier his future would be. He was different from Lu Dehai. He was different from most people. He was Chen Fangqing's secretary. It had been less than 24 hours since Li Tianlan came out of the desert prison. Chen Fangqing had lost 3 immediate family members. Chen Lijuan even died in front of him. The bloody and fierce aura came to him with a strong desire for revenge. Yuan Lin could clearly feel the danger and tragedy. Emperor Dong's palace, the Wang family of Beihai, and the Prime Minister. The 3 parties were really at each other's throats now. If Chen Fangqing failed, it could be foreseen that Yuan Lin's future would be bleak. This was the best result. If there was a little mistake, not to mention a bleak future, it would be a problem whether he could live or not. Yuan Lin lowered his head and carefully studied the documents in his hand. His body trembled slightly and he gritted his teeth. "You're scared. And very angry. Does this mean that you have no confidence in the next development of the situation?" A voice with a faint smile suddenly sounded. Yuan Lin's body suddenly shook, and he raised his head reflexively. "Who?" There was a familiar sound of wind in the private room. Yuan Lin almost instantly thought of the heavy snow in front of the cabinet office. It was an extremely fierce wind and an extremely sharp edge. The invisible wind in front of him was not as sharp as that, but it was much heavier. He thought of Qin Lijuan's body with thousands of penetrating wounds. Yuan Lin's face was pale, and there was some panic and despair in his eyes. A figure quickly outlined in the seat where Lu Dehai had sat. This was a figure that looked slender and tall. There seemed to be some fluctuations wrapped around his whole body, like starlight or clouds. No one could see his face clearly. He sat opposite Yuan Lin. Yuan Lin could vaguely see that he was smiling. He smiled and nodded, seeming to be very polite. "I'm just a lobbyist." Night fell. The shining light of the city in the air became more and more magnificent and dreamy. The Passat was still parked there. Daybreak leaned against the seat, listening to the music, and closed his eyes to rest. Li Kuangtu gently tapped the edge of the window, thinking about something. The heavy and violent wind blew from a distance, all the way into the city in the air. Daybreak instinctively opened his eyes, and his eyes were alert. "He's here," Li Kuangtu said faintly. Daybreak frowned, thinking of the wind just now, and whispered, "It's a little strange. It's not his real body." Li Kuangtu shook his head. His fingers were still tapping the edge of the window. One after another, transparent sword chi slowly spread out along the window, constantly extending upward and entering the city in the air. The space in the box was twisted silently. There was no sound of wind. The air twisted into a vortex at a speed visible to the naked eye. The vortex kept spinning, and it became more and more scattered. Countless scattered lines outlined Li Kuangtu's figure, which looked more and more real. Yuan Lin was stunned, then stood up and said respectfully, "Your Highness." Li Kuangtu raised his head and looked at Yuan Lin quietly. After a while, he nodded slightly and said casually, "Sit down." Yuan Lin seemed to have adapted to the unusual way the two guests appeared, and slowly sat down. "It's not you who asked me out." Li Kuangtu glanced at Yuan Lin, and then his eyes fell on the cloud of starlight in front of him. It was a cloud of starlight that even he could not see through. "It's me who asked you out." In the cloud, His Majesty smiled sincerely. "I have a lobbyist, Your Highness. Since you are here, you might as well listen to what he has to say. The price offered by the Prime Minister of Xianxia State is generally not low. If you can reach an agreement directly, I am willing to keep silent throughout." Li Kuangtu carefully examined His Majesty's figure. The sword chi was densely intertwined, forming an extremely blurry domain. Obviously, the other party was not his real body. It was a sword energy projection like him. Li Kuangtu looked at it quietly. For a moment, he did not know whether the other party did this out of caution or to show his strength in front of him. He was silent for a while, looked at Yuan Lin, and asked directly, "What does Chen Fangqing want to say?" "The Prime Minister hopes to have a deep cooperation with the Purgatory of Heaven Capital," Yuan Lin said respectfully. Li Kuangtu moved. The sword energy projections suddenly became illusory, but his face became more and more real. For example, Yuan Lin could not adapt to the other party's straightforward rhythm. He could only bite the bullet and said, "The Prime Minister hopes that Your Highness can participate in the decisive battle in Beihai. At least for now, he has the same position as you. If you can make Emperor Dong's palace disappear, the Prime Minister is willing to give you a reward that you can't refuse." Li Kuangtu snorted softly and said calmly, "Be more detailed." "As long as Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai disappear, he can decide to give a part of the core industry of the Wang family of Beihai to the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. At the same time, he will officially accept the Purgatory of Heaven Capital back into Xianxia State and be responsible for the development of Tianan." Yuan Lin took a deep breath and said calmly, "That is to say, if you can satisfy the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister will definitely satisfy you. In the absence of Emperor Dong's palace, Tianan, including Xinyuan City, will belong to the Purgatory of Heaven Capital in the future." "That sounds pretty good," Li Kuangtu said lightly. Yuan Lin took a puff of his cigar. In the light smoke, his voice was a little low. "The Prime Minister can do that." Li Kuangtu did not comment. Now, Chen Fangqing's promise was undoubtedly a bit funny. However, if Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai disappeared, Chen Fangqing could indeed do that. Cooperating with Chen Fangqing meant joining the alliance of His Majesty in front of him. Li Kuangtu quickly thought about the pros and cons. He suddenly looked at His Majesty in front of him and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" "I only have one question," His Majesty said with a smile. "Now the whole dark world thinks that Li Tianlan will become the new chosen one. Your Highness, have you really seen or understood the ultimate state of the chosen one?" "The ultimate state of the chosen one." Li Kuangtu's pupils shrank slightly. Before he could speak, His Majesty had laughed. "You don't want to see it?" He smiled and said, "I can guarantee that. So, this is the reason for our cooperation this time. Divine Emperor of 9 Heavens." Chapter 905. Li Kuangtu quietly looked at His Majesty in front of him and remained silent for 5 minutes. The extreme state of the Chosen One. For him, this was an extremely strange word. The Chosen One was the Chosen One. This was not a realm, so where did the extreme state come from? He took out a cigarette from his pocket and pulled out one. Wang Lin subconsciously handed him a cigar with both hands. His Majesty's eyes narrowed, a little playful. Wang Lin might not realize anything or he didn't understand, but His Majesty knew very well that the Li Kuangtu in front of him was a projection of sword energy, just like him at this time. A projection actually took out a cigarette from his pocket? He thought of Tribulation, who was superb in the shadow domain and could even be said to be at the peak. It was rumored that Tribulation was Li Kuangtu's student at the beginning. That was to say, the Li Kuangtu in front of him had changed from the initial projection to the real body? It was a silent transformation. His Majesty didn't even notice it. Based on this alone, he could roughly judge the degree of Li Kuangtu's recovery. Was such a move a deterrent from the other party to him? Or a warning? Li Kuangtu waved his hand, stubbornly lit the cigarette in his hand, took a deep breath, and said in a low voice, "Extreme state." There was obvious doubt in his eyes. That's the extreme state. His Majesty nodded affirmatively. The most invincible person is in the most perfect state. The corners of Li Kuangtu's mouth twitched, and his eyes clearly said, "Don't talk nonsense with me." Thick smoke came out of his mouth, and his smile was a little playful. "I've been to Eastern Europe, but I didn't see you in Mormons." His meaning was obvious. In the past 100 years, it could even be said that after the ancestors of the Wang family of Beihai and the Lin clan, the only one in the whole dark world who could be called the Chosen One was Wang Tianzong. This title was not a clear realm, but a powerful and invincible dominating power that could completely sweep everything. Wang Tianzong's performance in Mormons fully deserved this. He, Li Shi, and Lin Fengting were no match for Wang Tianzong together. Without the eternal sword, Li Kuangtu had reason to believe that Wang Tianzong in that state might not be a match for Wang Tianzong even if he was besieged by a few more people, or even if all the experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world attacked him together. Such an invincible realm was called the Chosen One, and Li Kuangtu recognized it. He had seen, faced, and battled the so-called geniuses. And this so-called His Majesty didn't even appear on the battlefield. Yet he was talking to him about the extreme state of the heavens' favorites. How ridiculous was that? His Majesty looked at Li Kuangtu and said with a smile, "I didn't go to Mormons." Li Kuangtu narrowed his eyes. He didn't know if the other party was telling the truth or not. He just said casually, "So? It's not important." His Majesty shook his head. "You and I both believe that as long as there is enough time, Li Tianlan will reach Wang Tianzong's state sooner or later. I don't know how much confidence you have in continuing to break through, but for me, the possibility of me reaching that level is not high. To say the least, even if I can reach that level, Wang Tianzong was far from reaching the limit of the Chosen One at that time. His strength may be enough, but his ruling power is far from enough." Li Kuangtu chuckled and said with a faint smile, "Then tell me, what do you think the limit state is? Or, where have you seen it before?" His voice was cold. At this moment, he really felt that he had been ridiculed. In Mormons, he and Lin Fengting broke through to the peak of the invincible realm and entered a new level. Together with Li Shi, who was at the peak of the invincible realm, they formed the most powerful fighting combination. But the trio was easily defeated by Wang Tianzong. And such a result, in His Majesty's eyes, was Wang Tianzong not ruling enough? Did he mean that Wang Tianzong was not strong enough? Or did he mean that he, Lin Fengting, and Li Shi were too trash at that time? His Majesty seemed to realize something. After a moment of silence, he said softly, "Sorry, no matter what you think, I don't mean to ridicule you. It's just that Wang Tianzong did not reach his limit state, and I haven't seen that state with my own eyes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be alive. But I can be sure that that state exists with a high probability. Especially now, it's almost 100%. To be precise, if Wang Tianzong and the Chosen One reached the so-called limit state at that time, you, Li Shi, and Lin Fengting didn't even have the chance to draw their swords. In that state, martial arts, thunder-shocking realm, invincible realm, peak of the invincible realm, or the so-called half-step chosen one, are all meaningless. They are all ordinary people, or rather, they are all non-entities. Li Kuangtu raised the corners of his mouth, and his smile became more and more obvious. He nodded seriously and said sincerely, "Amazing, really amazing." "You don't believe it?" In the starlight clouds, His Majesty seemed to frown. "I believe it. Let me tell you a secret. The limit state can also be surpassed. The chosen one who surpasses the limit state can topple mountains and overturn seas. Do you believe it?" Li Kuangtu laughed, but his voice did not contain the slightest hint of a smile. His indifferent eyes were full of disapproval. His Majesty waited until his laughter stopped, shook his head, and said lightly, "The 13th floor." Li Kuangtu was stunned. His Majesty sneered. "Isn't the sword in the desert enough to explain the problem? That sword penetrated a distance of tens of thousands of meters in 1 second, no, in half a second. The air combat team, the armored core, the invincible realm, the murderous weapon, nothing could stop it. The 13th floor is a sword formation, and Xianyuan Feng is a murderous weapon. The murderous weapon is alive, yes, but without Li Tianlan's sword intent and sword energy, do you think Xianyuan Feng can do this? Well, even if this doesn't explain anything, what about Mormon's sword? The master of Samsara Palace is at the peak of the invincible realm. Xianyuan Feng only had the eternal sword in her hands, which directly ended Wang Tianzong. Doesn't this explain the problem? What realm is Li Tianlan in now? What realm is the master of Samsara Palace? Why don't you think about it? If Xianyuan Feng in his heyday was in your hands, how much power could he exert? If Wang Tianzong didn't have the coldness of 9 states in his hands at that time, but Xianyuan Feng, what state would he be in? Li Kuangtu suddenly fell silent. His face became extremely gloomy in an instant. This question, he really didn't seem to think about it. Mormon's eternal sword ended Wang Tianzong and also led to the death of the master of Samsara Palace. Everyone thought that it was the master of Samsara Palace's desperate outburst and the incredible sword formation of the 13-story tower. Almost no one thought that it was Xianyuan Feng's problem. No one mentioned this question after Wang Tianzong was ended and the master of Samsara Palace died. It wasn't until the sword appeared in the desert the day before yesterday that people realized the nature of Xianyuan Feng. But immediately after Li Tianlan left the desert, the revenge of the Wang family of Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace came roaring. When the undercurrent of Zhongzhou state was surging, Li Tianlan appeared in Sai City again. The bloody storm directly swept through the 2 legions of snow country. People didn't have time to consider the specific problem of Xianyuan Feng, until His Majesty pointed it out in front of Li Kuangtu. Extreme state. Li Kuangtu took a deep breath and muttered to himself, "Now there are still a few murderous weapons in the dark world that haven't integrated with Xianyuan Feng, and Li Tianlan hasn't entered the invincible realm. Even so, with Xianyuan Feng in his hand, do you have the confidence to win?" When he officially reaches the level of Wang Tianzong, in the peak state, with the most complete and fully charged Xianyuan Feng in his hand, that's the extreme state of the chosen one. Do you think you have the chance to draw the sword? His Majesty's voice was faint. Li Kuangtu held a cigarette and sat expressionlessly, motionless. In addition, I can guarantee that both the sword formation of the 13-story tower and Xianyuan Feng are very compatible with Li Tianlan. Well, it's the kind of compatibility that you can't imagine. One of the map of God of War of the Li family should focus on balance and physical strength, which means that Li Tianlan can enter the invincible realm faster. Not to mention the extreme state of the chosen one, it's hard for us to stop Li Tianlan at the peak of the invincible realm unless we can take away his Xianyuan Feng. Is there a chance? Li Kuangtu suddenly asked. Taking away Li Tianlan's Xianyuan Feng, this not only reduced the upper limit of Li Tianlan's combat capability, but also enhanced the strength of their own side. His Majesty's aura became deep in an instant. He was silent for a long time, then shook his head slightly and said quietly, "It's hard to say at the moment." He hesitated and seemed to be a little hesitant. Even if there is a chance, it's not very sure. The Xianyuan Feng taken away will also fall into the hands of the Wang family of Beihai. Li Tianlan will grow up very fast, but Wang Tianzong's injury is also unknown. Moreover, Xianyuan Feng has a complete consciousness. Such a sword, unless it is willing to betray Li Tianlan, we can't use it. Li Guangtu fell silent again. He was a little annoyed and lit another cigarette. Facing the current Li Tianlan and Xianyuan Feng, if you go all out, how sure are you to kill him? His Majesty suddenly asked. Li Guangtu narrowed his eyes and seemed to be thinking. After a while, he said lightly, if it's a one-on-one fight, I'm not sure I can kill him, but if it's a one-on-one fight, I'm at least half sure. His tone was very calm. He was determined to kill Li Tianlan, and he was very eager. But if it was a one-on-one fight, he was really not sure that he could kill the current Li Tianlan. Therefore, he took a fancy to the upcoming final battle in Beihai. He wanted others to think that he was hiding in the dark when he was recovering from his injuries and to make a sneak attack at the most critical moment. One fatal blow. Li Guangtu didn't care at all whether it was glorious or not. After he occupied Emperor Dong's palace and Tianen and created a new dynasty, who would remember the story of the loser? And it happened that Chen Fangqing also wanted to cooperate with him. Li Guangtu didn't agree, but he didn't have any reason to refuse. The key was how many benefits or valuable promises he could get. His appearance here had already shown his attitude, and he believed that His Majesty and Wang Lin beside him were clear about this. How sure are you? Li Guangtu's tone was low, and he stared at His Majesty in the clouds. The starlight cloud around the other party was a domain that was condensed to the extreme. In terms of martial arts level alone, Li Guangtu could be sure that the other party's martial arts level also surpassed the peak of the invincible realm and stood at the same level as him. This shocked Li Guangtu secretly, and he was also a little vigilant. Even if the final battle in Beihai would go smoothly and get the result he wanted, there would also be obstacles on his way in the future. Not to mention Wang Tianzong, whose state was unknown. The mysterious His Majesty in front of him was destined to be a big threat in front of him. However, the other party's state seemed a little strange. The other party's realm was there, but his aura was extremely unstable. For a moment, Li Guangtu couldn't determine the other party's true combat strength. I'm not sure at all. Li Tianlan has Xianyuan Feng, and I'm no match for him at all. But I can barely protect myself. In the clouds, His Majesty's laughter was very sincere. Li Guangtu couldn't be sure whether it was true or not, so he could only take it as a lie. The current situation is very clear. Li Tianlan has become very dangerous. Time is always on his side. We don't have time. We can't even wait for a year now, let alone 10 years. Li Tianlan's state is perfect in all aspects. This may cause him some trouble, but as his martial arts and body are balanced, he will soon enter the invincible realm. The best way is to kill this huge threat in advance. This final battle in Beihai is a good opportunity, even the best one. His Majesty's tone became serious. Neither of us is sure to deal with Li Tianlan with Xianyuan Feng, but if you and I work together, we are almost 100% sure to kill him. Now the situation in Zhongzhou State is complicated. If Li Tianlan dies, it will be good for everyone. Prime Minister Chen Fangqing can get out of trouble. As for you and me, he laughed. As long as we win the final battle, Tianan will belong to you, and Kunlun City will belong to me. The city belongs to me. This is the best outcome. Tianan will belong to you. This sentence directly stabbed into Li Guangtu's heart. He thought of the castle that was like a mountain. He thought of the big and exaggerated fountain square. He thought of the whole Shenyuan city that was like a huge construction site. He thought of the city in the air club at this moment. He thought of the tens of thousands of square kilometers of Tianan. What Lu Dehai's research group could collect, so could the purgatory of heaven capital. It might not be so detailed, but it was enough for Li Guangtu to know what Shenyuan city meant. Those things that made them jealous, envious, afraid, and fearful, everything was what Li Guangtu wanted the most. Even in his dreams. Li Guangtu took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and glanced at Wang Lin. The first deputy director of the Cabinet General Office, who had been silent, finally found an opportunity. He subconsciously straightened up and said with a smile, "Your Highness, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I can promise the Purgatory of Heaven capital that as long as there is no Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai in Zhongzhou State will fully support the Purgatory of Heaven capital." In fact, this is not only a promise, but also a practical need. We can't let the dark world of Zhongzhou State fall into chaos and become a masterless area infiltrated by various forces. Without Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai, we must find a new guardian. Your Highness, you used to be the god of war of Zhongzhou State. For us, you are the most suitable candidate. The god of war of Zhongzhou State is not me. Li Kuangtu twitched the corner of his mouth. Perhaps many years ago he was the god of war of Zhongzhou State in many people's hearts. But he had never sat in that position. At that time, the god of war of Zhongzhou State was his father, Li Honghe. He was just the commander of the Border Control Corps of Zhongzhou State. The first commander of the army. Wang Lin's smile stiffened, and then he changed the topic awkwardly. He forced a smile and said, "Your Highness, you should know that even the Prime Minister needs support. We are very sincere." Li Kuangtu nodded and looked at His Majesty. "Me and him? You and I can coexist." His Majesty said with a smile in his voice, "We must also coexist. This is a plan that everyone, including Li Huaqing, can accept. Because of balance." Li Kuangtu leaned back, and his whole body sank into the sofa. "Is this also the reason why Li Huaqing quit?" "Yes, because of balance." His Majesty nodded. "We don't comment on the termination plan. But after the termination plan was exposed, the reason why Li Huaqing could quit decisively was that he didn't want to damage the overall interests of Zhongzhou State because of the game, but he had other choices, which is also very important. The so-called choice is the Lin clan's participation. If the Lin clan replaces Kunlun City, it can reach a relatively stable balance with Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace. In this case, even if Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace cannot be solved for the time being, the ruler of Zhongzhou State can take advantage of this balance to better control the current situation. If the Lin clan doesn't replace Kunlun City, then Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace may compete with each other in the future. But once their positions are threatened, they will cooperate with each other, one in the south and one in the north, to resist the pressure of Zhongzhou State. The Lin clan, which has connections with both Emperor Dong's palace and Beihai, can completely coordinate this problem with its own advantages. If not for this, even if Li Huaqing knows about the termination plan, he can only bite the bullet and go on without a way out. So, in Li Huaqing's heart, neither Beihai nor Emperor Dong's palace is the most important. What matters is balance. Li Huaqing can completely accept the destruction of Emperor Dong's palace and Beihai. He is the president, and his most basic requirement is stability. If stability can make the future of Zhongzhou State better, he will definitely accept it. Your Highness, there is no grudge between you and me. If we replace Kunlun City and Emperor Dong's palace respectively, we can also reach a new balance. Compared with the uncontrollable Li Tianlan and the profound Wang family of Beihai in the future, our existence is more acceptable to Zhongzhou State. Li Kuangtu was silent for a while. He looked at Wang Lin and suddenly asked, "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Two aspects." Wang Lin narrowed his eyes and chuckled. "First, the Prime Minister hopes that you can transfer the elite forces of the Purgatory of Heaven capital to Beihai, go all out to win, kill Li Tianlan, and completely destroy Mount Dibing. Second, during the decisive battle in Beihai, the Prime Minister hopes that the Purgatory of Heaven capital can destroy Emperor Dong's palace and occupy Xianyuan City as soon as possible. I can go to Beihai by myself." Li Kuangtu frowned. "This is not a suitable choice." Wang Lin said cautiously, "Li Tianlan, Sicangye, Wei Kunlun, Flaming Fire, Sai City, Mount Shu, and a large number of elites of the Dark Knights. Although Emperor Dong's palace suffered heavy losses in the desert, Li Tianlan can still mobilize a lot of forces, which is not easy to deal with." His Majesty's sword chi projection shook slightly. Li Kuangtu frowned and looked at Wang Lin. "Do you need me to analyze the situation in Northern Europe with you?" Li Kuangtu said lightly, or do you have no confidence in the Jiang family of South America and the Vatican? The forces of the Jiang family of South America and the Vatican are restraining the Dark Knights in Northern Europe, and Flaming Fire is unable to take care of them. As for Situ Zhongyue and Wei Kunlun, they are from Zhongzhou State after all. Can't the Prime Minister even restrain them? Under normal circumstances, we can do it. Wang Lin narrowed his eyes and said with a smile, but if Li Tianlan loses his mind, we can't guarantee that we won't fall out with Sai City and Mount Shu. At that time, he will gather all the forces he can and kill in the decisive battle regardless of the consequences. Lose his mind? Li Kuangtu subconsciously changed his posture. He leaned more comfortably on the sofa and asked slowly, why would Li Tianlan lose his mind? Because of the termination plan. Wang Lin said quietly, now, we can't give up the termination plan. His voice was calm and cold. Wang Yuetong is about to die. Chapter 906. It was not the first time for Li Tianlan to come to Tian'an, but it was the first time for him to come to Xianyuan City. The helicopter that took off from Yuzhou flew all the way over Nanyan, Ningbian where the Freedom Corps was located, and went straight into Xianyuan City. This city was named by Li Tianlan, but it had been developing rapidly for 2 years outside of his sight. The rotors of the helicopter roared and rotated in the air. Standing in front of the cabin and looking down, Li Tianlan could clearly see the basically completed city center, the construction of several other districts, and the demolition of almost the entire city. Construction companies from all over Zhongzhou State were working hard, and all kinds of construction equipment covered the whole field of vision. Li Tianlan looked at it quietly. His deep and serene pupils shone with a strange brilliance. I like it here. Qin Weibai leaned against Li Tianlan and said with a soft smile. Such a Xianyuan city was like a piece of white paper. Every construction company, every construction machine, every transport vehicle, and every worker was the brush and ink on the white paper. Everyone and all their efforts were trying to draw the most perfect pattern on this white paper. The current Xianyuan city could not be said to be beautiful. Its downtown area might be luxurious enough, but compared with the ruins in most areas, this kind of luxury was extremely abrupt. But this kind of city that was changing every day was enough to make people feel relaxed and happy. The sunlight shone through the cabin on Qin Weibai. She gently held Li Tianlan's arm, and there was unconcealable longing and happiness on her perfect and flawless face. Li Tianlan looked at the city below quietly. After a long time, he nodded seriously. How do you feel? Bai Qingzhao, who came to Xianyuan City with Li Tianlan, asked with a smile. It was not the first time for him to come to Xianyuan City. He was the Deputy Secretary General of the Army Headquarters, and one of the most important tasks was to grasp the detailed movements of the Tian'an Freedom Corps. The headquarters of the Freedom Corps was in Ningbian. In the past 2 years, Bai Qingzhao would come here almost every month, and he would also come to Xianyuan City to take a look. It was no exaggeration to say that every change in Xianyuan City was under his sight and attention. Li Tianlan was quiet for a moment and whispered, I'm overwhelmed with emotions. Only these words could clearly express his feelings at this time. This was the first time for him to see his own city, his own country. The glorious future that countless people had been looking forward to was no longer an illusion. Instead, it had become incomparably real here. It was not until this moment that Li Tianlan truly felt the power. It didn't belong to martial arts, but it was his power. It was a power that could carry him to the peak. This place will definitely become the most beautiful city in Zhongzhou State in the future, just like Shenzhou City before. It's a product of a special background. It's hard to replicate and can't be replicated. Bai Qingzhao sighed with emotion. Emperor Dong's palace is now worthy of Xianyuan City, and Xianyuan City is also worthy of Emperor Dong's palace. Li Tianlan looked into the distance. In the distance, there was a sparkling pool of water. Looking down from the sky, Xianyuan City was almost divided into 2 parts by an artificial lake, which was not very vast but had a great atmosphere. Numerous uniquely shaped arch bridges connected the 2 sides of the artificial lake. The lake water was flowing gently, surrounding a mountain-like castle. The surroundings of the castle were oppressive and quiet, and it revealed an indescribable solemnity. Li Tianlan fell silent. Qin Weibai and Bai Qingzhao also fell silent. Surrounded by the lake, Emperor Dong's palace was like an island in Xianyuan City. At this moment, countless people on the island stood around the castle. The simple and heavy black and white color covered the bright flowers and green grass around the castle. White banners fluttered around the island. The area on the left behind the castle had been separated and turned into a huge morning hall. Everyone in Emperor Dong's palace stood outside the castle, waiting for something silently. Li Tianlan pressed his lips tightly, and his eyes were deep and firm. The reason why he gave Huinan was also because of this matter. More than 1,000 soldiers of the nightmare troop who died in the desert would be buried tomorrow. As the palace lord of Emperor Dong's palace, Li Tianlan had to be here. Nothing was more important than this matter. The helicopter landed slowly on the tarmac of Emperor Dong's palace. Li Tianlan took Qin Weibai's hand and walked out of the cabin. His expression was calm and steady. In his sight were the members of Emperor Dong's palace, dressed in black formal suits with white armbands on their arms. The senior members of Emperor Dong's palace he was familiar with were all gathered together. Most of them were people Li Tianlan found familiar or had never seen before. But they were all members of Emperor Dong's palace. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. Before he could say anything in his sight, the dense crowd bowed slightly at the same time and said in a uniform voice, "Welcome back, Your Majesty." The neat and loud voice echoed over Emperor Dong's palace, and the sound waves were extremely intense. "Your Majesty. Welcome back, Your Majesty." Li Tianlan subconsciously straightened his body. He looked deeply at the crowd around him and didn't speak for a long time. 2 years in the desert prison. Emperor Dong's palace grew from nothing. Xianyuan City grew from nothing. Li Tianlan had too many things to do. For example, to meet the new high-level and quasi-high-level figures of Emperor Dong's palace in the past 2 years. To meet the chief administrator and chief judge of Xianyuan City. For example, to let everyone in Emperor Dong's palace understand the purpose of Bai Qingzhao's visit, many things. But he did none of them. Under everyone's gaze, he nodded slowly and said calmly, "Go to the morning hall." His voice rang in the ears of every member of Emperor Dong's palace. The crowd automatically parted. Ning Qianxing, the first mayor of Xianyuan City, came over and said softly, "I'll take you there." Li Tianlan shook his head, pointed to Bai Qingzhao beside him, and said slowly, "Qianxing, this is Secretary General Bai of the Army Headquarters. On behalf of the Army Headquarters and Minister Dongqing, I'm here to express my condolences to the families of the martyrs. Arrange for the Secretary General to meet the families of the martyrs first. Don't be afraid of trouble, this is something that must be done. Take me to the morning hall during the day and I'll be there soon. Do the families of the martyrs have any requests? Zhongzhou State will give them some compensation, but Emperor Dong's palace also needs to give them enough compensation and pension." Ning Qianxing nodded and then shook his head. The families didn't make any requests. Li Tianlan was silent. What was the use of making requests? They were all gone. But they were all gone. If they didn't want compensation, what else could they ask for? He took a deep breath and patted Ning Qianxing on the shoulder. "You go with the Secretary General first, I'll come later." Ning Qianxing nodded and shook hands with Bai Qingzhao solemnly. Li Beidian, who was a little weak but still in good spirits, came to Li Tianlan and said in a low voice, "The morning hall is behind the castle. The location of the cemetery was decided 2 years ago. We used this artificial lake and circled a small island not far from the castle. There is enough space. In the future, the graves of Senior Li and the seniors of the Li family can also be moved here. I mentioned this to you when you were in the desert, and I'm waiting for your decision." Li Tianlan nodded and suddenly said, "Why do we circle an island? There are many places near the castle." The corner of Li Baitian's mouth moved as if he wanted to explain something. Finally, he shook his head and said softly, "We've invited a feng shui master. The location of the cemetery is the best in terms of feng shui." Li Tianlan was silent for a while and nodded. He took Qin Weibai's hand and said softly, Let's go and have a look. I was supposed to write a big chapter today. I had a stiff neck last night and it hurts so much. I'll see how I feel tomorrow. If it doesn't hurt, I'll write a big chapter. Chapter 907. The sun was setting. After dinner, Huang Tong walked quietly on the huge and empty training ground, looking around with empty eyes. There were still a few soldiers training on the training ground, and they all looked listless. Not far away, 2 companies were gathering, but their slogans were weak. Huang Tong watched all this quietly, and his eyes became more and more empty. The news has spread, and now the response from the middle and grassroots is very strong. General, I can't control the situation in the regiment. If possible, I hope the higher-ups can give me some support. A tall middle-aged man in his 40s followed Huang Tong carefully, and his voice was a little bitter. Huang Tong walked forward silently, like a walking corpse, and did not speak for a long time. He was now at the encampment of an infantry regiment in the Beijiang military region. The regiment commander was a middle-level officer he valued very much. He was capable and educated. If there were no accidents, Huang Tong intended to promote him to a higher level. In a situation where the entire northern borderline was in a state of panic, Huang Tong had high hopes for this regiment, the regiment leader. Therefore, the first stop of his inspection was here. In fact, it proved that this infantry regiment codenamed War Tiger still maintained a certain military atmosphere. At least 1 or 2 figures could be seen on the training ground occasionally. Compared to other places, this was already good. In one day, to be exact, in the past less than 12 hours, the order of the Beijiang Corps had completely collapsed. The Desert War had ended for nearly 2 days. In the past day, the morale of the generals and soldiers in Beijiang was low. What completely collapsed the order of the entire corps was a piece of news. Bai Qingzhao, the Deputy Secretary General of the Army Headquarters, went to Tiannan with Li Tianlan, the Palace Lord of Emperor Dong's palace. They went to pay their respects to the victims and the families of the victims. This was the attitude of the Army Headquarters. The moment the Beijiang Corps received the news, it completely collapsed. The Desert War was the war between the Corps and Emperor Dong's palace. Many people died in Emperor Dong's palace. But even more people died in the Corps. Such large-scale casualties were extremely rare since the founding of the People's Republic. Under normal circumstances, as soon as the war ended, they should be able to see the big shots from Yuzhou and hear their promises. Then what awaited them was the mourning of the whole country. They should be heroes remembered by Zhongzhou State. This was inevitable and there would be no exceptions. But the so-called inevitable did not happen. Until the end of the war, Zhongzhou State had no attitude at all. They seemed to have completely forgotten about the northern border army. A large number of corpses were left in the desert. Zhongzhou State didn't care about it. There was no comfort and promise from the big shots, and there was no mourning. Not to mention it in the news, there was no reason for it to exist. And the most representative of Dongqing Wudi in the army headquarters had gone to Tiannan. The corpses that had not been cleaned up in the desert seemed to have died just like that, without any explanation. There was not even any news about the pension that would soon be paid. The entire northern border army was dead silent. Compared to blaming Zhongzhou State, the endless resentment was all concentrated on Huang Tong, the head of the Beijiang army. Without any orders from the military headquarters, he insisted on mobilizing most of the northern frontier army's combat power. It was clearly a war, but the situation reported to the military headquarters was a drill. During the critical period, he even cut off the army's contact with the outside world. All of this showed that the war was Huang Tong's personal decision. At least it was not recognized by Zhongzhou State on the surface. It was all Huang Tong's fault that the bigwigs of Zhongzhou State did not come. Everyone could see this. Therefore, when Zhongzhou State turned a deaf ear to everything here, the ordinary soldiers and the middle and grassroots officers of the army were extremely disappointed with Huang Tong. The ordinary soldiers stopped training. The grassroots officers didn't care. The order of the army was issued to the middle-level officers. The middle-level officers just made a phone call to deal with it, and then reported to their superiors that they couldn't handle it. In various companies and regiments, countless soldiers' applications for reinstatement increased wildly. Some middle-level and high-level officers had already submitted their transfer applications. They could be transferred anywhere as long as they were not under Huang Tong's command. The higher-ups of the army were gloomy, and the deputy of the army distanced himself from Huang Tong as soon as possible. All kinds of reports flew to the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State like snowflakes. The order had been completely out of control. Huang Tong wanted to interfere, but he was powerless to do so. From the standpoint of the army headquarters, what Huang Tong did was completely treason. But after getting Qin Fangqing's support, the war he started was hard to define. But Dongqing Wudi was not without a temper. For what Huang Tong had done, it was good enough that he was not arrested on the spot after the war. It was simply a pipe dream to ask the army headquarters to pay for what Huang Tong had done. For Huang Tong, this was really the end of the road. Now his only hope was Qin Fangqing. Although he knew that Qin Fangqing's situation was not much better, Huang Tong had no other backers. "I will communicate with the army headquarters." Huang Tong said slowly, "Hold on for a few more days. I will definitely give you an explanation about Beijiang." The regimental commander nodded with a bitter face and said helplessly, "I'll try my best, but, General, this matter needs to be done as soon as possible, especially in terms of pension. If it is not in place for a long time, the families will not agree." Zhongzhou State had always been the fastest in terms of pension. In most cases, the notice and pension were basically in place at the same time. If this point was not implemented as soon as possible, it was very likely to cause a worse impact. The corner of Huang Tong's mouth twitched slightly. He nodded expressionlessly and said, "I see." He walked slowly to his car and said flatly, "You do more work and put more effort into the affairs of the regiment. Leave the pension to me." The regimental commander nodded and said respectfully, "I understand." Huang Tong nodded, opened the door and got into the car. The car started slowly and left the Fighting Tiger Regiment. The phone rang in the silent car. Huang Tong took out his phone and glanced at it blankly. It was his secretary. He frowned slightly, pressed the answer button, and said in a low voice, "What's the matter?" "General?" On the other end of the phone, the secretary, who had been with Huang Tong for several years, said with trepidation, "The army headquarters. There is news from the army headquarters. It's..." Huang Tong's heart tightened slightly. He narrowed his eyes and said in a low voice, "What news?" "The army headquarters." The secretary took a deep breath and said, "The army headquarters." Minister Dongqing sent a document. Huang Tong could clearly feel the secretary's embarrassment and fear. He frowned tightly and waited patiently. Minister Dongqing approved the maneuver plan of the Beijiang Corps. Maneuver plan? Before the Desert War, the reason Huang Tong reported to the army headquarters was that the Beijiang Corps was going to conduct a maneuver in the desert. No one believed this reason. But it was at least a reason. And this bullshit reason, Dongqing Wudi approved it. Huang Tong gritted his teeth, his face twisted and ferocious. He could understand what Dongqing Wudi meant. Dongqing Wudi approved the maneuver of the Beijiang military region. He also casually defined the Desert War as a maneuver. So in the eyes of the army headquarters, everything that happened in the Desert War and the loss of the Beijiang Corps, none of this happened at all. Naturally, there was no clear statement, let alone the so-called pension. Because it was just a maneuver. Huang Tong gritted his teeth. He thought of Bai Qingzhao, who followed Li Tianlan to Tunin, of everything in the Beijiang Corps, of his situation and his next fate. The corner of his mouth moved. A mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth and sprayed into the carriage. "General." The driver was startled. As the steering wheel tilted, the black car suddenly shook on the street. "It's okay." Huang Tong slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. His face was pale and he said gloomily, "Drive?" He silently hung up the phone and kept muttering to himself, "Dongqing Wudi? Dongqing Wudi." The phone rang again. Huang Tong, who was desperate, slowly lowered his head and looked at the phone screen. He was slightly stunned and subconsciously narrowed his eyes. On the phone screen was not a phone number, but a name recorded in the address book. Jiang Shan. Chapter 908. Strictly speaking, the relationship between Huang Tong and Jiang Shan was very ordinary. One of them was the chairman of Beijiang, and the other was the commander of the Beijiang Corps. Although they met a lot on weekdays, they basically maintained a superficial harmony. Jiang Shan was a senior counselor in Zhongzhou State. To some extent, he could be regarded as one of the leaders of the Prince Group. But as his old leader gradually left the senior management of the Prince Group, his position also changed subtly. Of course, in the general direction, Jiang Shan could often be in line with the group. But in many cases, some of Jiang Shan's actions seemed to indicate that he had some other ideas. In the Prince Group, Jiang Shan, the counselor, seemed to always maintain a vague boundary with other leaders. This boundary gradually became a barrier, and the barrier gradually expanded and finally reached its peak a few years ago. In the last election, the Prince Group originally wanted to promote Jiang Shan to become a director of Zhongzhou State. That meant that he would become the flag figure of the Prince Group and cooperate with Chen Fangqing to control the future direction of the Prince Group. From counselor to director, the promotion might be the pursuit of most counselors. Although there was a barrier between Jiang Shan and the Prince Group, they could barely maintain the same general direction. Moreover, after he became a director, Chen Fangqing would keep an eye on him, so there would be no big trouble. Once Jiang Shan became a director, he would inevitably leave Beijiang, and the Prince Group could take advantage of the situation to firmly hold Beijiang in the hands of trustworthy people. Jiang Shan worked as a director for one term and retired honorably, which was a happy ending for everyone. However, Jiang Shan refused the proposal of the Prince Group, and it was a very clear refusal, leaving no room for negotiation. He did not choose to become a director to promote his rank, but continued to stay in Beijiang. In order to resist the internal pressure of the Prince Group, Jiang Shan made a lot of big moves in Beijiang. Two directors of Beijiang, who could be said to be the confidants of the Prince Group, were directly removed. The system of Beijiang was constantly changing, and Jiang Shan, who did not hide anything, directly widened the gap. In a short time, with his prestige, Beijiang almost became his private kingdom, and it was tightly managed. As a last resort, the Prince Group could only continue to let Guo Wendian take the position of director, and at the same time, find a way to take over Jiang Shan. Jiang Shan was also working. At first, he wanted to unite with the Wang family of Beihai by marriage and let Jiang Shangyu marry Wang Yuetong. If Wang Yuetong married Jiang Shangyu, it could be said to be a real marriage of lower status. But if he used Beijiang and a counselor as bargaining chips, it was not unacceptable. Jiang Shan had enough confidence to propose marriage, but Wang Tianzong refused his proposal. In desperation, Jiang Shan could only retreat and began to flirt with the Special Warfare Group. Gu Xingyun was naturally very welcoming of Jiang Shan. The Special Warfare Group and the Prince Group had also gradually drifted apart in recent years. There would be no psychological burden for him to accept Jiang Shan. After Gu Xingyun vaguely expressed his support for Jiang Shan finally became stable in Beijiang. His current situation was a bit delicate. Although he was still a member of the Prince Group, he also had the support of the Special Warfare Group. When they did not have absolute confidence to take him down, the Prince Group was not very willing to touch him, but no one would really treat him as one of their own. In this situation, the relationship between Huang Tong and Jiang Shan was naturally not good. Every time they met or talked, Huang Tong always maintained a certain degree of vigilance and defense. The phone kept ringing. Huang Tong looked down at his phone and hesitated for a moment before pressing the answer button. He somewhat despised Jiang Shan's slippery ways, but he would not deny the other party's upbringing. At the very least, he was sure that Jiang Shan didn't call to mock him. "Chairman, I'm Huang Tong." The call connected, and Huang Tong's indifferent voice sounded from the back seat of the car. On the other end of the line, Jiang Shan chuckled. "Old Huang, Secretary General Bai has gone to Tiananmen. Have you received the news?" Huang Tong's face darkened as he gritted his teeth and snorted. You're in a very bad situation right now. I don't need to say more. I'm sure you know that yourself. Jiang Shan's voice was calm and calm. What are you trying to say? Huang Tong frowned, his tone cold. The Northern Borderline Army cannot go out of control. I am the Northern Borderline's chairman. I am responsible for everything that happens in the Northern Borderline, including the Northern Borderline Army. Jiang Shanping said indifferently. Huang Tong pondered for a moment, and a sneer gradually appeared on the corner of his mouth. If there was no reasonable solution for the tens of thousands of dead in the Beijiang army, the whole Beijiang would fall into chaos. The families of the tens of thousands of dead would gather in Beijiang, which would even lead to a series of huge social problems. As the speaker of Beijiang, Jiang Shan could hardly absolve himself from the blame. Once that happened, Huang Tong was bound to fall. But he was only a lieutenant general and his weight was far from enough. The Prince Group would inevitably take advantage of this opportunity to take over Jiang Shan and replace him with a real member of their own. Therefore, Jiang Shan's phone call seemed to explain his attitude. He was afraid. Huang Tong suddenly relaxed and seemed to find some comfort in his heart. His laughter was a little sarcastic. No one is willing to let the Beijiang army go out of control. I am the first person responsible for this matter. It's not good for me if the army goes out of control. But what can I do now? I just received a notice from the army headquarters. The army headquarters has agreed to the maneuver of the Beijiang military region in the desert, and then there's no then. What can I do? If the pension problem of tens of thousands of people can't be solved, the Beijiang army will exist in name only. The army headquarters, the army headquarters. His voice became louder and louder, and finally turned into a roar to vent his anger. But in the end, his voice gradually lowered, becoming resentful and desperate. You reported the maneuver to the army headquarters, and the army headquarters gave you a clear response. There's no problem in any aspect. Jiang Shan said slowly. But the actual situation is not like this. Huang Tong growled in a low voice and said in a suppressed voice, I don't believe that the army headquarters will ignore the Beijiang army. The life and death of tens of thousands of people is a huge social problem. They can't ignore it. I'm afraid, you're afraid, but isn't Dongqing Wudi afraid? Is it possible? Impossible. Jiang Shan said lightly. In the end, the army headquarters will definitely intervene in this matter, and the pension will be issued, but that will be after you are completely torn apart by the soldiers of the Beijiang army and the families of the deceased, and after the Prince Group has suffered a major blow. Old Huang, there is no hope for you. Losing your reputation is a light punishment. In the current situation, before the army headquarters intervenes, your only end is to die without a burial place. Huang Tong gritted his teeth. His face was a little pale, and there was obvious fear in his eyes. The most frightening thing was often the truth. He knew that what Jiang Shan said was true. He couldn't refute the truth at all. Do you want to live? Feeling Huang Tong's silence, Jiang Shan suddenly laughed. His laughter was extremely low, with an indescribable temptation. Take your family and go far away. Live a good life. Take your family away and live a good life. You can get a sum of money that you can't spend in this life. Take the money and your family away before you are smashed into pieces. How about that? Huang Tong suddenly shivered. At this moment, listening to Jiang Shan's voice, he suddenly felt a little numb. What do you mean? It's very simple. Old Huang, it's your best chance to get out now. I can provide you with a sum of money, 9 figures, which is enough for you to squander for a lifetime. You can take your family abroad, Italos, East Island, or South America. You can choose. I'll arrange it as long as you let go of everything in the Beijiang army. In fact, the Beijiang army doesn't belong to you anymore, does it? Then what do I need to pay? Huang Tong forced himself to calm down, but he couldn't calm down no matter how hard he tried. You hardly need to pay anything. Jiang Shan's laughter became deeper and deeper. As long as you listen to me completely, I can give you everything I just promised. Huang Tong held the phone stiffly and was silent for a long time. After a long time, he took a deep breath and said in a dry voice, You want the whole Beijiang? On the other end of the phone, Jiang Shan laughed. He suddenly thought of what Jiang Shangyu said on the phone with his son a few hours ago. He said the original words, Li Tianlan can get the whole Tianan. Why can't we get Beijiang? You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.